Guten Morgen miteinander. Very good morning, everybody. It's a great pleasure to see at least some of you here, and not only on the screen. 3D is much better than 2D. And I think with all the precautions we have, I think it's much better really to meet like that and not already now go into the Omicron hectic again and go back to the halls. So it's my great pleasure to welcome you to this, important event, accelerating transformation, and within the overall topic of sustainability, but sustainability science, sustainability research for really contributing not just to discussions, but contributing to transformation. Yes, it is very special that we have this event in this room, that I can welcome you here. When I first had the possibility to talk in this room, we actually had here the conference on We Scientists Shape Science. And during these discussions, we were really emphasizing how important it is that also we are looking a little bit inside our science culture in order to make a contribution to society and therefore politics. Not politics first society. And this was a very, for me, touching event that for the first time the Academies have brought it to the point of really how we also as scientists are not just continuing with the models of science that we have always pursued, with also some of these hopeless competition characteristics, with this really concentration on chairs and the big dinosaurs instead of concentration on those who are really driving the science, the generations who follow us. So this was wonderful, and that we are actually did this long before we had actually, or certainly a bit before we had the COVID pandemic. And then comes the COVID pandemic, and then people are even louder in saying that the planet is in bad shape and so on. That's not true. The planet is already much longer in bad shape and needs particularly attention, and not just focus on one or the other topic, but on how we really work together in our functions in order to contribute to a better world. The pandemic only amplifies what is already present in a society. So the pandemic is a wonderful, in inverted commas, wonderful PCR reaction that shows what are the tendencies and where we really need to move forward. It was in this spirit before pandemic, but concerned with the issues of sustainability and with the Sustainable Development Goals that we then, starting in the academies, in the SCNAT, in the Natural Sciences Academy, we ask not only the question, how important is it to talk about the 17 sustainability goals, but how important it is about to talk about poverty or to talk about water, but really what can we, and particularly also with the Swiss context, of course with our partners in the world, can contribute meaningfully to the whole thing. And that's when the whole group, this whole sustainability research the initiative was launched. And the important thing there was, again, not just talk, because we, in our functions, all of you go from numbers of podium discussions, forum discussions, round tables where people talk, or waffle, I would even say, high-level, low-content type of waffling about how important it is to look at sustainability, how important it is to look at poverty and so on. And we said, from the academies, from the science, and within this spirit that I talked about science culture, how can we make a contribution by identifying what is the priority research that needs to be done, and not just what we have to think about and say we have had nice discussion. And it is in this spirit actually then this initiative was born with Gabriele, with Peter and many others who said, yes, here we would like to show a commitment. And that's wonderful. And I think this is wonderful. And I thank Gabriele, I thank Peter, and the whole community that has contributed that we can move here. And we really have moved. That's why we can have this meeting today. And as you know, here in this report, discussion then said, we not just go one by one in terms of the Sustainable Development Goals, but we actually go to the priority themes where we really examine this role of science. Here in this report, those who have not taken it, it's still more around, a little bit of propaganda. But we have the 6 themes, as you can know very well, so that a correct title is Food for People and the Planet. And there's the thriving spaces, actually the sustainability and the spatial development, not only in time, but in space. Also the issues. Then the net zero greenhouse and gas emissions society, the economic and financial systems. I think here I was particularly pleased that this comes out, that we are really looking at systemic issues and how we have the resources and not just say we need and we do and we should always have had, but really actually rethink systems and not just rethink issues. And then afterwards, the shared values, visions, and pathways for sustainability. This is I only don't like the word of vision, because vision, if you have a vision, then you see things. So then bloody hell do it. And you not just only talk about visions, but that's another issue. This you can discuss, but what I like is the pathways for sustainability, that we in a concrete way, that attenuates these visions before in the title. In a concrete way, you see how we can move forward. And then, of course, the dealing with the synergies, the trade-offs, and the common threats. That is also a systemic way on bringing things together and not just actually see a threat, here a threat there, but bringing them in a systemic way together. And, of course, at the end, that we should not just have all these great ideas for science, but that we are also see what are actually the enabling factors that bring really this type of science forward, and this type also of science towards the translational elements. And that's why the topic of today, the acceleration of transformation, is the topic that is really ripe. It's not because it's now time that we have a forum. It is now really prepared with these 6 themes that we can really talk, how can we accelerate the path based on good science, but with a good science in a translational way for our societies in the very local context, but also together with our partners in an international context. That's why we are here for. And the final word, I also like that it says accelerating transformation, and it doesn't say accelerating interventions. Because if we have all these noble goals that we want to work with the society in a sustainable way, you rather aim at bringing transformation than at just designing an intervention, a measure that should then be implemented. Measures have always the risk that they are not sustainable. Transformations are processes, again, in a systemic way to bring societies forward. So I'm really very happy that I could open this forum, and I thank you very much for this privilege to have a few words to you, and I thank you for coming, and I hope you will have a stimulating day which will accelerate transformations for the benefit of our society. Now back to Gabriele. Thank you very much.
Merci, Marcel. Okay. Thank you, Marcel, for these inspiring words of welcome. Ladies and Gentlemen, Mesdames et Messieurs, meine Damen und Herren, ich möchte Sie auch von meiner Seite sehr herzlich begrüßen. I'd like to welcome you to today's event. Also those of you who are watching us via the live stream and cannot be here. A very warm welcome. Wir sind sehr froh, dass wir uns trotz allem noch persönlich treffen können. Ich denke, das ist sehr wichtig und ich hoffe, dass auch viel Inspiration und neue Ideen dabei entstehen werden. My name is Gabriela Wülser and I'm the Head of Sustainability Research at the Swiss Academy of Sciences, and I will be your continuity announcer of the day. As you are noticing, our main language of the day, at least in the plenaries, will be English, but there will also be some German contributions, and we will follow the rule chacun dans sa langue. Also, if you have questions, if you pose questions from the audience, please feel free to just speak freely in your own language. You might have heard that since Friday in the canton of Bern, we have to wear masks. We are obliged to wear masks inside, and the only exceptions are when you are speaking or when you are eating and drinking. Of course, you can take off the masks. But we would really like to ask you to just wear your mask all the times or at all other times. Whether you are following us online or here with us in Bern, we would like to encourage you to use Twitter. Here is our hashtag to contribute to today's discussions and just share your thoughts and ideas also on Twitter if you like. And then I would also like to point out to you that we have a photographer who is going to take photos in all program parts. And if you don't want to be on a photo that will be maybe shared on the web, please let us know. With this, I would like to move to our program. We will approach the contribution of science to acceleration change towards sustainability from various angles today. So first of all, we will look at the need for a sustainability transformation, its importance and urgency from the perspective of a nature protection organization, the WWF. After that, we look at the priority themes for research that we formulated last year, the ones that Marcel presented, and how they were useful for institutional agenda setting and strategy processes. This will be followed by a panel discussion on what is key to strengthen science for change. What do we need to address now? To us, there are at least 3 central questions that we must address to more substantially advance the implementation of the Sustainable Development Goals. So 1, how can we make the most effective use of existing knowledge? 2, what does it mean to conduct research for societal transformations towards sustainability? And 3, how can interactions between sustainability goals be prioritized and considered by decision makers? The parallel sessions invite you to delve into these 3 themes. After that, we will be ready for sharing and collecting our thoughts on the way forward. Based on the discussions in the parallel sessions, we will collect the big challenges we need to address to accelerate societal transformation. And we will discuss how a flagship funding program should be designed so that we can tackle these challenges, since research funding is an important lever for this endeavor. Finally, we will enjoy some closing words by our president, Peter Edwards, before we round off the day with an apéro. If you cannot remember all that now, we have put the program on a program poster. It's right next to the coffee machines. You find it there and you can always check the program. But I will, of course, follow you through the day, so lead you through the day. So we hope that this day will be exciting and inspiring for you. Speaking of inspiration brings me to our first highlight. I am very pleased to welcome Thomas Vellacott for his keynote on transformation pathways to sustainability. Thomas is CEO of WW Switzerland, and prior to taking on this role in 2012, he was responsible for developing WWF's partnerships with the private sector and subsequently spent 9 years heading up WWF Switzerland's national and international nature conservation projects. Before joining WWF, he worked in private banking for Citibank and as a consultant and engagement manager for McKinsey. Today, he serves on boards of several non-profits and startups in the sustainability space. Thomas will share his thoughts on the need for societal change required for a sustainable future. Please, Thomas, the floor is yours.
That's a good start. Thank you for the introduction. Thank you for the invitation to be here. It's everyone says it, but it still is a true privilege to be in a room with people and not be staring at a screen. I mean, how could I resist coming to a conference with a title such as this? You know, how can we accelerate this transformation we're on? And I'm very happy to share a few words about the subject. I thought what I would do is talk a little bit about how we view this transformation to sustainability that we're in at the moment, and then talk a little bit about the role of science in that transformation and the role of transformation for science. Now, I won't bore you with a lot of the science behind what we're doing because you probably know it much better than I do. But I did want to start with this chart simply for two reasons. One, it shows the atmospheric concentration of CO2. And I think it's important because it shows the kind of uniqueness of the moment we are in. So how the CO2 concentration in the atmosphere hasn't been at these levels for hundreds of thousands of years in the history of our planet. So this is a very unique moment. Unique in the sense that we are beyond the kind of situation we know about, beyond the situation in which human societies developed. We're really in terra incognita here. And the second reason why I wanted to start with this, and with a second chart, which is from the IPBES on extinctions, which also shows that, again, if you look at extinction levels, we're at a level we haven't been for a very, very long time. The kind of extinction levels we see today are quite unique in that they're much, much elevated. And I wanted to show you these two charts to emphasize that uniqueness of this moment, the urgency for moving and for moving fast, and to also say that these two crises, so biodiversity loss and climate change, are intricately connected, and we cannot address one of them without addressing the other. We are convinced that we need to go after both of them, otherwise we are not going to be solving either of them. Now, that has been known for a while, and I think what is different today is that the knowledge that this is a unique moment and that we need to act fast, the urgency is really something which has struck many people only quite recently. And we see a very large shift, even in the last 3 to 5 years, just in people's attitudes towards questions of sustainability. And I think two things have really changed. One is people have realized this is urgent now. This isn't something that might be coming down the road 50 years from now. And the other thing is it's not just threatening polar bears, but it's threatening us and it's threatening our children. And I think that goes to very different, that addresses very different instincts in people when we feel threatened or when we feel our children are threatened. Now, not everyone's understood the urgency. You know, some of us are still playing golf. But you know, you can do that, but it sort of gets a bit less pleasurable, and you know, the stench in your nose from the burning forest, this is a real picture, by the way, it just gets to you after a while. So I think the number of people who are realizing this urgency and the need for action has really changed in the last couple of years. And I think that's a huge opportunity we have. And it's not just people in general that have changed their attitude towards sustainability and towards climate and biodiversity crisis. It's also people in power. It's very much business has been getting this idea that this may actually be important for them. Now, here's a quote from James Gorman, the CEO of Morgan Stanley, who said, "If we don't have a planet, we're not going to have a very good financial system." I've not decided yet whether this is incredibly deep and philosophical, what he says here, or incredibly banal, or incredibly cynical, in that the only reason you need to save the planet is that we have a financial system. Anyway, I don't know what is behind it, but I think it's incredibly important that people like him realize that this is actually business relevant for them, because then they will pay attention. And it's not just individuals, but you see this development in things like the global risk report that the World Economic Forum publishes each year. You don't have to be able to read this, just look at the colors. What they do is they ask their members every year, what are the biggest risks in terms of likelihood and in terms of impact? And the green risks are environmental risks. At the bottom of the page, you have the year 2012. At the top of the page, you have the year 2021. And if there's one thing you will see on this chart, it's that green is more prevalent at the top of the page. So at the bottom of the page, environmental risks were basically not on the agenda of business leaders worldwide. In 2021, it's dominating where they see risks. If you take the risks by likelihood, 4 out of 5 of the top risks are environmental risks. 3 of the top risks by impact are environmental risks. So this message is getting through to business leaders. That's incredibly important, because that changes a lot of how fast we can move and how we can accelerate this transition. And governments are recognizing, or I put it a bit more cautiously, beginning to recognize the need for action, although a huge gap remains. I'll be coming back to this chart a few times. What you see is the trajectory we've been on historically in terms of global CO2 emissions, and then where we were before Paris, that's the red line going up, where we've come to in terms of stated policies with Paris. And then you see Glasgow with the yellow wedge there with announced pledges. And you see green, should probably be red, the remaining gap in order to get to net zero by 2050. And, you know, you can see the glass as half empty or half full, but something has been changing since Paris, and that's important. And anyone who says, you know, these COPs are a waste of time because they're just waffle and blah, blah, think again. Something is changing here. Now, 2 big challenges remain. One is an implementation gap. So just because you've put it into your policies doesn't mean you're actually be doing it. So there's a huge need there to stay the course and to actually make that happen. And then there's the ambition gap, which is the remaining gap there to get down to net zero. This is a huge challenge. This is a huge challenge. It's a huge transformation, but it's not something we talk about as it has to come in the future sometime, but it's something we're in the middle of today. And I think that's important, and that's something which has also changed. So there we go. We're on this transformation journey. We're not moving fast enough, but we are moving. And I think one of the huge contributing factors to the fact that we are moving is the role of science in many, many different ways. So a very, very big thank you for the work you do every day in terms of contributions towards sustainability from science. I'll just give you a few examples. I mean, at the most basic level, what science has enabled in terms of the transformation is economies of scale. What you see here on your left is the experience curve of photovoltaics, which has been coming down, the price of photovoltaics, which has been coming down like crazy over the last 50 years. For each doubling in installed volume, you've had the cost going down by 28%. That is one of the factors that has been driving this revolution we're seeing. It's that this stuff has been getting cheaper. And it's that people who read Forbes magazine have been starting to noticing that it gets cheaper, and that today in many places it's cheaper to put up new renewable energy infrastructure than to keep the fossil energy infrastructure running. That is a huge difference. That changes so much. And that's not just one scientific discovery at the outset of this, but that is continuous scientific work for making this technology cheaper and more accessible. And if something reaches price parity, a lot of things happen in this world which is dominated by economics. And that's one example. I'll give you one more. This is electric vehicles. On the left, you see quarterly sales of electric vehicles worldwide. They've just reached 10% of all cars sold worldwide. That's more than doubled in 1 year. So we're on a pretty exponential curve here, which is dearly necessary, and we can argue about the merits and problems of electric cars for ages, but this is a hugely relevant development in terms of decarbonizing the transportation sector. And it's part of this larger picture. On your right, this is a forecast of how sales of electric cars on the upward slope and internal combustion engines on the downward slope will change over the next couple of decades. And this is not an unusual picture to see this kind of replacement of an existing technology. In fact, we can go back to the beginning of the 20th century and look at the market share of horses in transportation, which in 1905 lay at 97% market share, and within 20 years dropped to 5% market share as the internal combustion engine and cars took over. So these kind of shifts happen very, very rapidly. We underestimate the speed at which these transformations happen because we don't get this experience curve development, we don't get exponential growth and exponential change very well. So I just want to give you a bit of a sense for how fast this is happening. It's still not happening fast enough, but it's way faster than anyone had expected. And science plays an incredibly important role in that. The second incredibly important role that science plays is that it increasingly informs decision makers' actions. Maybe for you as scientists, it doesn't seem that way because it seems like you're constantly communicating and no one's listening to you. But the role that bodies such as the IPCC or the IPBES have been playing is absolutely crucial. And I've seen it change substantially in the last 20 years. I mean, that was unthinkable a few years ago, the kind of attention that this work gets among worldwide leaders. And not just leaders, but it's getting through to the public. Your messages are getting through to the public. What you see here is a survey that was done a few months ago on what the biggest political challenges are in Switzerland. And it's interesting, this was this autumn, it was in September, I think it was made. And number one was climate change. And you get slight differences. If you take the Sorgenbarometer, it's the pandemic, and then climate change is number two. But the top three, so CO2 emissions, climate change, pandemic, and pension reform, those three are top of the scores, pretty much whichever one you look at. So people are starting to realize that something has to change. People are starting to realize that there's this sense of urgency. And I think that's important to see that we're getting through with that message. And finally, organizations such as WWF, we could not be doing our work without scientific basis, whether that's counting populations without which we couldn't be doing our protection work, or whether that's initiatives such as Science-Based Targets initiatives, of which we were a founding member, which helps companies set science-based targets for their CO2 emissions. So this stuff is important. So I just want you to get a sense that Science plays an incredibly important role for this transition we're in. Without it, this wouldn't be happening on many different levels. And then I'd like to move on to, okay, what does that mean for science itself? And that science itself probably has to transform as well in order to play the role it needs to play and it has started to play in this transition. And I'll go back to this picture. Again, just the speed at which this needs to happen. This is not business as usual. For any sector, this is not business as usual. This is actually on a par with the most fundamental transformations we've seen in our history as a species. The most recent one we can probably compare it to is the Industrial Revolution. That's the kind of deep transformation of our economies and societies that we are talking about here. Except this is happening 3 times faster than the Industrial Revolution. So it's Industrial Revolution on steroids, if you will. That's what's going on. But it's important to have that in mind, because that was a deeply, deeply disruptive period in human history in many different ways, positive, negative, whether it's in thought, whether it's in politics, whether it's in economics. That's the kind of period we are in. We are no longer in the kind of stable period we were in post-World War II, where we were quite happy with business as usual. And if we take this as a parallel, the Industrial Revolution, then it's interesting to think about the role that science played in the Industrial Revolution and the role that scientific institutions played. Well, what happened in the 19th century? Well, the existing universities added new subjects to their curricula, and new institutions such as the ETH emerged during that period because there was a need for totally different skills which were not being provided by existing institutions. And there was this, so there was a change, a fundamental change, disruptive change in society. There was a subsequent or concurrent disruptive change within science, within academia. And I think those two developments happened in parallel and sped each other up. And I think that's exactly what we're seeing now as well. So as the world around us changes at a speed we've never seen before, our academic institutions need to change at a speed we've never seen before if they are to remain relevant. And I think we're seeing that kind of change, and I think you are part of that kind of change. The realization that it's important to understand systems, how they work. It's important to understand where we need to go in terms of target knowledge, the 1.5 degrees, the net zero. But then what we also need is transformation knowledge. How do we get there? How do we overcome the inertia that is in our systems? How do we get that rapid transformation going? And I think that's where reports, and here's my second advertisement, we've had the first one for your report, is this is excellent in terms of laying the basis for that kind of transformation we need to see. It's excellent and urgent in terms of the topics you identify, including how we can change economic and financial systems. It's excellent in terms of the role it gives to transdisciplinary work and how we need to overcome our limitations in terms of our subject silos. So I think this is a really important step. It's a first step, and we need to go further, and we need to put it into action. And I think that's why conferences like this are so important. And so what do we need now? And I'll leave you with 3 thoughts on this. One is, I think we need this focus on the most relevant challenges. And it's wonderful you have the SDGs up here in front of you, because we don't have to argue anymore about what the most relevant challenges are. You know, we have this consensus of the worldwide community in terms of the SDGs. That's what we need to contribute to. That's where we can measure whether we are making a relevant difference or not. So I think that's a really good starting point in order to channel where we put our energy in terms of further work. The second thought is we need to integrate approaches from different disciplines. These kind of systems we are trying to change at warp speed are so complex that we'll never be able to do so from a purely looking at one discipline and trying to solve it within one discipline. So we need these kind of transdisciplinary approaches. Otherwise, we don't have a chance of actually solving these problems. And we need to learn to talk with each other, with people from different disciplines. We need to learn to work with each other and to come up with concrete results. And I'll just give you an example. It's incredibly valuable to have reports such as the IPCC's report on the 1.5 degrees and what the difference means between 2 degrees and 1.5 degrees, because now everyone is talking about 1.5 degrees before they weren't. So that's hugely important. But if we then get popular votes like we did in this country in this summer, where a majority said no to a CO2 law, which wasn't out of this world in terms of its ambition level. It was just trying to make steps towards implementing net zero. We have a problem. We have a problem to overcome. And I think that's where we need science as well, not just to come up with the wonderful reports, but to help us to make those reports reality and put them into implementation in our political systems, in our societies, in our economies. So please consider that an invitation to help close those gaps, because we need implementation at the end of the world, at the end of the day. Freudian slip. At the end of the day, the climate doesn't care about our declarations, it cares about what we do. And my final point, so, work on what's relevant, work in a transdisciplinary way, and reach out beyond academia. You are the most brilliant minds in the world, but you're not going to solve this on your own. You need to reach out and work with practitioners out there. And that's a role that's a space we've been trying to work in as well, in order to overcome some of those barriers that are there. One of those projects we have is something called the One Planet Lab, where we bring together people from science, people who are implementing concrete solutions, startup innovators, and try to accelerate the kind of change we need to see regarding circular economy, and really get that community connected and getting it working together. And those are the kind of initiatives we need to see a lot more of, and those are the kind of exchanges, and not just exchange in terms of talking, but exchange of working together that we need. So there we go. And if we look forward, I said, it's the last time I'll show this chart, promised. We are in the middle of this transformation. We are going very fast, but we are nowhere fast enough. So we need to speed up. We are not on the course we need to be in order to hit net zero targets by 2050. Actually, before 2050, when it comes to developed countries. So we really, really need to speed up. If there's one thing that keeps me awake at night, it's that we're not moving fast enough. So any way we can speed this up, I think, is incredibly important. And the final thought is we need courage, because we need to break out of existing systems. We need to challenge business as usual, and that's incredibly difficult. And I'll just leave you with these two wonderful people to finish off with. On your left, you've got Sir Isaac Newton. Now, Newton is, of course, world known for what he did on his work in physics, in mathematics. He's less known for his writings on theology. He actually wrote quite a bit on theology, but the reason he's not known for it is because he was smart enough not to share it with many people. Actually, some of his works he encoded, and they were only decoded in the 20th century, because he realized that what he was doing was so dangerous to his career that it would have ended his career if it had been known. Because he was fundamentally challenging one of the most basic doctrines of the Christian faith, which was the Trinity, which is incredibly ironic because he was at Trinity College, Cambridge. But he challenged the Trinity, but he knew that he could not do so in public. And he just about managed to get out of being ordained, as professors were at the time in the Church of England. But it was a fine line he was walking. But he basically challenged the notion, which up to then had been universal, that if you do science, you do it within the parameters set by the church. And I think that was incredibly brave. The person on your right is a lady by the name of Emily Davis. She was a women's rights activist in the 19th century. She worked very much to open up university education for women. She was the founder of Girton College, Cambridge, the first college in Cambridge University, but also in the British Isles that allowed women. She fought huge battles. After the college was founded, they had to wait another 80 years before the university gave women degrees. So in the meantime, she did alternative examinations because they wouldn't let women into the examination room. So things like that. So again, she worked within the existing system, but boy, did she challenge the rules. And I think that's what we need again today. We need people who have the courage to work within institutions, but not to play by rules which come from the 19th century, but to rewrite those rules in a way that they are fit for the 21st century. So if ever you feel like what you are doing feels like you're banging your head against walls, feels like you are fighting against structures which are not fit for our times, that you are trapped in incentive systems which incentivize ever more narrow knowledge generation rather than transdisciplinary work, take a sigh of relief. You are working in the footsteps of people such as Davis and Isaac Newton. And we need people who challenge those rules. And that's my final thought I'd like to leave you with. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Thomas. So we now have time, about 15 minutes, for questions from the audience. So who wants to start and ask a question? And you can ask your question in your language, and you can take off the mask for speaking, because otherwise we won't people on the watching the live stream won't understand you if you speak through the mask. That was told. Yes, Philippe, there's just the microphone approaching you.
Just in terms of, thank you very much for your presentation. Just in terms of general communication, the stability we're talking about, the post-war stability, is very short, not more than 2 generations. So the changes are constant. If you think of the post-war, electricity, atomic energy, etc., has changed the world, at least Switzerland. And we have to be conscious that that stability has not been very long, and it's changing all the time, and humanity is facing changes all the time. So there's nothing new, but we have to be conscious of that. These challenges are not new.
No, I agree, definitely. And sorry, I didn't...
It's in terms of communication to the public, because people usually think, wow, we're going to be, it's horrible. It is a kind of horrible thing, but we have to face it, and we can, I think.
Yes, no, I fully agree, and sorry if it came across like it hadn't been changing. Of course it has been changing, but I think it's important that we tell people that the kind of transformation we're in is not going to be a walk in the park. It's going to be quite a journey we're on here. You know, sometimes you get, we have these arguments as well. Should we be sort of sugarcoating the message and say, it's all going to be really easy and we'll just all have solar panels and be happy and so on? And we have to be careful there. I think we have to, this is going to be a deeply disruptive period. We're in the midst of a deeply disruptive period. And I think it's just important to make that case and not to sort of sugarcoat it. At the same time, I fully agree we don't have to, Martin Luther King didn't get up and say, he got up and said, I have a dream. He didn't get up and say, I have a nightmare. And a lot of our communication is the kind of I have a nightmare communication. And yes, let's state the problems, let's state the dangers and be clear about that. But then let's also show how we can, how we can overcome those challenges.
Yes, there's another question here. Janet, the microphone is coming.
So I was very impressed with your comment on the One Planet Lab. I will look that up very soon. But this reminds me that there really are a lot of activities going on that are going in the right direction, but they're very fragmented. And I wonder if you have some idea about how those activities could be somehow brought together, aggregated, even just cross-reference so that they build up some more substantial visibility so people get the sense that there is something that they could join in with, that they don't have to start from scratch?
Yes, I share your assessment that it is a very fragmented sort of space. Maybe two thoughts. One, it's events like this which are important, and it's events where we bring together the different communities which may otherwise not mix. So we as WWF try to do a bit of that, but other institutions are doing that as well, and I think that's incredibly important. I was at an event yesterday in Geneva that brought together the NGO community, the international organizations, and the bankers within Geneva, because they don't talk to each other normally. So I think it's those kind of events that we need, because at the end of the day, that's not going, that bringing together that agenda is not going to happen through some kind of top-down fiat, but it's going to happen through community building, and we just need to bring together the different communities. And I think the second thought is, that's where I think initiatives such as yours are so important, because you can provide the kind of basis like the report, or the kind of, making the connections. You need people who have one foot in more than one community, who can make those connections and who can point out, why don't you talk to that person? I'm afraid it's a lot of work, but that's, I think, how it happens.
Definitely, thank you. There's just the next. Yeah, you seem to be the next one, René. Please. There are more questions. You and you.
Danke für den schönen Vortrag. Ich möchte jetzt mal ein Statement oder eine Frage stellen, die an die Basis geht. Also wie kriegen wir die Transformation in der Bevölkerung hin? Wir können große Reden halten, wir können, weiß ich nicht was machen, aber irgendwo im Alltag muss ja etwas passieren, vor allem bei den jungen Leuten. Und ich war letztens bei einer Tagung der liberalen Kirche im Kanton Zürich. Und ich habe dann den Redner gefragt, wo sind die Kirchen in der ganzen Diskussion? Und er hat dann gesagt, es war ein Deutscher, wir sind mit uns selber beschäftigt, wir haben keine Zeit, um uns mit Nachhaltigkeitsthemen auseinanderzusetzen. Und ich finde das so eigentlich erstaunlich auf der einen Seite, aber ich weiß, dass es so ist. Ich war an einer Konvention der Pfarrer im Kanton Zürich und habe denen mal gesagt, die ganze Nachhaltigkeit muss doch ein Thema sein im Konfirmationsunterricht oder bei den Katholiken im Firmen. Es passiert nicht, die haben keine Zeit, sie sind mit sich selber beschäftigt. Und der letzte Punkt ist, in dieser liberalen Kirche wurde auch diskutiert, wie müsste man eigentlich die Bibel umschreiben, oder? Das ist vielleicht ein bisschen provokativ, um auf diese Probleme einzugehen und nicht irgendwelche, es gibt nämlich sehr schöne Geschichten in der Bibel, die extrem relevant sind für die jetzige Zeit. Man muss sie nur so interpretieren. Also die Frage wäre, warum neben den Schulen, warum sind die Kirchen, das weißt du vielleicht nicht, oder? Aber ich möchte das einfach mal in einen Raum stellen und ich möchte propagieren, dass man auch auf dieser Schiene, dort werden nämlich Jugendliche erfasst, die nicht in den Mittelschulen sind und die genauso wichtig sind wie die in den Mittelschulen.
Yeah, really, really important point. So how do we reach people who are sort of maybe outside of the academic track, also young people, in order to get some of these messages through, and what role can the churches play? I agree that, that would be a fascinating topic of its own, but you don't have to rewrite the Bible. You can just look to different places in the Bible and go to better translations than some of the ones we have today. And you can look to people such as Francis of Assisi, who in the 13th century said a lot of things which are still relevant today. So I think there is that tradition within, and not just within Christianity, but within other faiths as well. We are finding that the faiths are playing an increasingly important role in the debate about sustainability. So they are starting to move, not fast enough like all the others, but they are starting to move. So the fact that Pope Francis, no coincidence the name by the way, that Pope Francis came out with his encyclica in 2015 before the Paris Climate Accord, entitled Laudato Si, again, Francis of Assisi, that was no coincidence, and that was a really important statement before that key climate COP. So I think the churches are starting to move, not just at the top, but very much bottom up. I was invited a few weeks ago to speak virtually at a church event, or an event organized by a religious organization in the UK. And that came bottom up. An organization called Green Christians that say, this is about creation, this is about safeguarding creation. Here in Switzerland, you have organizations such as Agroscope that are doing exactly that. So there may be minorities, but you have those voices. And I think they're incredibly important, not just within Christianity, but within all faith traditions. And if we want to reach audiences which are not already used to this kind of language, which have not already gotten what they need to, that this needs to change, it usually doesn't help if I speak to them as a representative of WWF. But if you want to convince farmers, get a farmer to talk to them. If you want to convince priests, get a priest to talk to them. So you need to work through people who can act as ambassadors, again, who can bridge the gap between different communities in order to get that message across. And that's why this kind of bringing together communities is so important.
Okay, now I'm a bit lost. So there were a few questions right here in front. I think you're first. And then we'll have some here. Jakob, Pete, Marcel, Rolf. Okay.
Thank you very much. Thomas, you mentioned several kind of knowledges that are needed to close the gap. And I think one you called transformation knowledge. Can you elaborate a bit on what you mean by that, and how will we acquire that transformation knowledge, and who is involved, and how do we build it up?
Yeah, and just to be clear, that's not a term I coined in my intellectual brilliance, but that's one I stole from other people. So you will find it in the report as well, and more information on it. But it resonated with me because that's where I feel we're missing a lot of the knowledge we need, and it's in that translation. It's in how do you make something actually happen in reality, and that's where you get into economics, that's where you get into psychology, into disciplines like that, and where we need to get them working together. I'll give you one example maybe. There's the whole theory around nudging and how we can encourage people to change behavior. Behavioral economics, behavioral sciences, and we have those problems all of the time in our work. So, how do you get people to eat less meat? By telling them to become vegetarians? By showing them pictures of the burning Amazon? Or, what actually makes them change? We have a cooperation with a company here in Switzerland that runs canteens, and they wanted to do something for the climate, and they wanted to make their contribution. They were a bit frightened when they found out that the biggest contribution they could make was actually reducing meat consumption in their canteens. They had hoped it would be, new dishwashers or something like that. Because they realized we cannot get people to stop eating meat. We've tried to do vegetarian Fridays and something, and they almost killed us. So, how do we get people to eat less meat? Well, they knew from their data that 2/3 of people who come into their canteens choose menu number 1. Irrespective of what menu number 1 is. It's often the cheapest, and it's the first thing you see when you go at lunchtime into a canteen and you're hungry. So just by putting vegetarian menus onto menu number 1 every once in a while, and not calling them vegetarian, because that puts certain people off, especially men. So they called it Méditerranée or something like that, and they made a huge change in meat consumption in a very, very short time by that little trick. And it's trying to deal with things like that, with very practical questions. How do you get people to change behavior? How do you get politicians to actually, look beyond the next 4 years, things like that?
So I think maybe Pete was next, then Marcel, then Rolf.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Thomas. Excellent and very inspiring presentation. I also heard, of course, the strong invitation to move beyond systems knowledge quite clearly, moving towards these targeted transformation knowledges, and that means, of course, debating the losers and winners around sustainability goals in concrete cases in our complex world and so on. So on that backdrop, my question is, the Science-Based Target Initiative, isn't that exactly the contrary, or is it a fallacy that we try to push top-down system-based targets on concrete debates? You know, how would you see that, and the risk of a greenwashing if you don't debate really the pathways that are needed?
I'll start with the second part of your question, which is the easier one. There's a huge risk of greenwashing, because the number of net zero targets that is being announced has just ballooned. I mean, it's among states, it's gone from about 20% 2 years ago to over 80% today of global greenhouse gas emissions covered by net zero targets, but also companies. And of course, the biggest challenge now is that if you start looking at what they're actually doing, not everything is green that has green on the wrapper. So you really need to. So we need tools to be able to distinguish what is green from what is just greenwashed. So to fully agree with that, and that was really the attempt or the motivation behind doing something like Science-Based Targets Initiative. That we said, okay, how can we move beyond just this net zero label to something that has interim milestones, something that has, a reduction curve behind it, where you regularly communicate about where are you on that journey, rather than just saying, I'm going to be there in 2050 and remind me again in 2048. So that's very much trying to do that. Your first point, are we imposing top-down? To some extent, yes, in that we say we think 1.5 degrees is what we should be aiming for, and everything above that is very, very dangerous. So, science-based targets has actually moved now from, you used to be able to pledge 2 degrees. You're not able to do that anymore. You now have to be aligned with 1.5. So I think we are doing that to some extent, so that criticism is valid in that sense. I don't think it's valid when it comes to the actual methodologies, because that is very bottom-up, the way that's being developed. I mean, we are constantly, and sorry, it's not a WWF initiative, we're just one of the co-founders, but SBTI is constantly working with companies and with science in order to come up with those pathways by sector. I mean, for example, a few weeks ago, it was announced that the first methodologies for the financial sector have been announced. That is huge work, but that is very bottom-up work in terms of, okay, let's look at a portfolio and how can we ensure that portfolio is on a trajectory to 1.5 degrees. So there I think we move very much beyond top-down.
So I think we have time for one more question. Jakob, I'm sorry, Marcel was first. And the rest of the questions can be asked during the coffee break, I hope.
Yeah, thank you very much, really, for stimulating us. I would like to come back to a point. We are now discussing a lot about the transformation, and but we are not very precise in the way of the role of science. I think it is really a danger, I would say, when you just say you must be courage and you must go out. We see things, as we see now in the pandemic, that very often we do not understand well the transmission belt from science to politics, to policy, and to implementation. I think it is, we are not here, and we did not create this initiative, and that's why I reminded a little bit what we did here. We scientists shape science. Is not that we transform scientists into activists, but actually that we are also thinking on how we have to generate the science base that is disruptive, the science base out of an transdisciplinary process that really facilitates this transmission belt to policy and to society. And I think this we should, in the further discussion, a little bit, take a little bit preciser. Otherwise, we are just going in a way that we are not doing the good science that is required for organizations like yours to really work heavily on the transmission belt. I think I think you agree on that one, but it was very much now just pushing for the transformation and less challenging us as a scientists also to make the meaningful contributions with great commitment. I think it's a fine line. In this room we said scientists don't make policy prescriptions. Scientists make policy relevant statements. And I think this was forgotten, particularly now also in the COVID situation, where where many scientists try to say what the social political process should be. I think I would like to hear your view on that one. But that was actually our way on keeping us on providing for the transmission belt the good science.
I think it's an important debate, and I think it is a fine line, or maybe it's a fine grey area there as well. I'm not even sure if it's a very, very clear line, if you can always draw that. But it is important to be clear about what the role of different actors is. And when I talk about transformation knowledge, then that's very much also a scientific question for me. So, the point I made about getting people to eat less meat, you can leave the activism up to us. We can do that, but we need your input in terms of what the good science is in order to get behavioral change, for example. So that is an exchange within a community that is where different people play different roles, but where they work together hand in hand in their different roles in order to affect something which we've all agreed on, which are the Sustainable Development Goals. So that's not political, we've got full agreement on that. So I don't think we're entering into politics there. We're just trying to get there, and we're trying to get there fast. And yes, we have different roles in that, and I would fully subscribe to that. And what I tried to give you as well was to kind of look at science also as a sector that is part of being transformed as part of this transformation we're seeing. If you talk to someone in banking today, their sector is very, very different to where it was 10 years ago. If you talk to someone in energy, their sector is very, very different. So I think we're seeing these sector transformations, and I think science as, in that sense, a sector is also being transformed.
Thank you so much, Thomas. Thank you for
Thanks for having me.
Been here. We just have a little present for you, so I follow you here. No problem. Thank you so much. This was extremely inspiring, and I really hope that these inspired discussions can now go on during the coffee break. We will have half an hour of coffee break, so enjoy the break. So, wir kommen nun zum nächsten Programmpunkt. Wir haben ihn genannt, The Value of Priority Themes for Institutional Agenda Setting. Und ich möchte noch kurz erzählen, wie es dazu kam. Und zwar haben wir ja diesen Report veröffentlicht vor mittlerweile einem Jahr. Und die Idee dieses Reports, dieser Priority Themes, war herauszufinden, und das haben wir auch mit mehreren Workshops gemacht, was sind eigentlich die Key Challenges, wirklich die wichtigen Herausforderungen für uns hier in der Schweiz als Land im globalen Kontext natürlich? Wo haben wir auch global die größten Hebel zur Veränderung? Wo müssen wir anpacken? Was müssen wir angehen? Und welche dieser übergeordneten, wirklich vernetzten Fragen, wo kann die Wissenschaft wesentliche Beiträge leisten? Und das Resultat waren diese 6 Priority Themes. Sie können sie auch sehen, hier sind sie mit Postern kurz beschrieben. Und ein positiver eigentlich Nebeneffekt dieser Publikation war, dass wir von mehreren Institutionen gehört haben, dass sie eigentlich diese Priority Themes dann auch brauchen konnten, dass die dann auch nützlich waren, um strategisch ihre Zielsetzungen zu überdenken, sich davon inspirieren zu lassen. Und ich freue mich sehr, dass wir heute 2 VertreterInnen, eine Vertreterin und einen Vertreter von 2 Institutionen bei uns haben, die uns erzählen, was das gebracht hat. Und ich finde das auch noch wichtig, weil es auch einen Punkt aufnimmt, den Thomas Vellacott vorher gemacht hat, nämlich, dass eben die Wissenschaft, die akademischen Institutionen selber auch von innen heraus sich verändern müssen, damit wir die nötigen Transformationsfragen angehen können und hier wirklich mithelfen können, die Transformation zu beschleunigen. Ich freue mich sehr, Corina Caduff vorzustellen. Sie wird unsere erste Inputgeberin sein. Meine Zettel sind etwas widerspenstig. Corina Caduff hat Germanistik studiert und an der Universität Zürich zu Elfriede Jelinek promoviert. Sie wurde 2004 Professorin an der Zürcher Hochschule der Künste, ZHDK, und seit Dezember 2017 ist sie Literatur- und Kulturwissenschaftlerin an der Hochschule der Künste Bern und auch Vizerektorin Forschung der Berner Fachhochschule. Corina Caduff wird uns berichten, wie die Priority Themes in die Erarbeitung des neuen Leitbildes der BFH eingeflossen sind. Und sie wird uns, glaube ich, auch nicht noch 1, 2 weitere Dinge erzählen. Bitte schön, Corina.
Ja, vielen herzlichen Dank, Gabriele Wölser, für die Einladung, hier zu sprechen und kurz darüber zu berichten, wie die Berner Fachhochschule mit diesen Priority Themes umgegangen ist. Meine Damen und Herren, guten Morgen. Die Berner Fachhochschule hat sich in den letzten 12 Monaten auf zentrale Weise mit der strategischen Neuausrichtung des ganzen Nachhaltigkeitsbereichs befasst. Wir verfügen an der Berner Fachhochschule seit 2018 über ein Ressort Nachhaltigkeit und haben dann aber vor einem Jahr definiert, dass Nachhaltigkeit ein neuer strategischer Schwerpunkt ist. Wir haben zunächst einen entsprechenden transdisziplinären Master lanciert, Circular Economy and Sustainability. Dieser Master wird ab Herbst 2022 dann am Start sein. Und wir haben vor einem Jahr ein Zielbild in Auftrag gegeben, um in der Forschung Themenschwerpunkte festzusetzen, von denen wir an der Berner Fachhochschule ausgehen können, um nachhaltige Forschung gezielter praktizieren zu können. Vielleicht kurz zu Ihrer Information, das ist die Ausgangslage an der Berner Fachhochschule. Wir haben auf der einen Seite Bereiche wie Gesundheit, Künste, soziale Arbeit oder Wirtschaft. Dann haben wir sehr technisch orientierte Bereiche wie Technik und Informatik, Architektur, Holz und Bau oder die Hochschule für Agrarforst und Lebensmittelwissenschaften. Also das heißt, sehr diverse Disziplinen, sehr diverse Departemente, sehr diverse Forschungskulturen auch. Das ist natürlich eine Herausforderung, aber in Bezug auf Nachhaltigkeit eben gerade auch eine große Chance. Das Zielbild, haben wir dann erarbeitet in einem breit angelegten, partizipativen Prozess mit verschiedensten Forschenden aus all diesen Departementen. Und wir haben es im Mai 2021 verabschieden können. Grundsätzlich haben wir verschiedene Handlungsfelder festgelegt. Gesellschaftliche Partizipation meint hier insbesondere strategische Partnerschaften mit dem Kanton Bern, mit den Städten Biel und Bern und auch aktive Dialogführung mit Gesellschaft, Politik und Wirtschaft. Unser Zielbild legt den Fokus ganz klar auf inter- und transdisziplinäre Ansätze. Das ist ja quasi notwendig für die Gewinnung von neuen, innovativen Lösungen. Forschung in diesem Bereich ist für uns also primär Forschung für Nachhaltigkeit, das heißt praxisorientierte Forschung, die eben auf die heute früh bereits viel diskutierte Transformation in der Gesellschaft, in der Industrie, in der Wirtschaft zielt. Also unser Ausgangspunkt einerseits von dem, was wir haben, eben von unseren Departementen, von bestehender Forschung und andererseits spielt es jetzt hier nochmal ein von den Priority Themes. Diese wurden ja 2020 weit herum beworben von der Akademie. Das passte für unsere Timeline ausgezeichnet, weil wir eben gerade auch in diesem Jahr unser Zielbild in Entwicklung gebracht haben. Und jetzt zeige ich Ihnen nun unsere Ziele, die wir in diesem Prozess definiert haben. Und da sehen Sie, dass die ganz nah dran sind. Wir haben also vier neue Themenschwerpunkte festgelegt. Das heißt, auf einer ersten Stufe hat der Report für uns eine sehr wichtige Rolle gespielt. Er war ganz zentral. Wir haben geschaut, wo können wir am meisten beitragen. Und auf einer zweiten Stufe haben wir dann versucht herauszudefinieren, was können unsere eigenen, unsere spezifischen Profilierungen, Fokussieren oder Schwerpunktsetzungen innerhalb dieser Schwerpunkte sein. So haben wir zum Beispiel bei Ernährungssysteme, sehr komplizierter Titel, unsere Titel sind alle sehr kompliziert. Bei den Ernährungssystemen legen wir deutlich mehr Gewicht als der Report auf die Seite des Konsums. Das hat damit zu tun, dass wir im Departement Gesundheit seit langem Jahr, also seit über 10 Jahren, einen Schwerpunkt haben, Diätetik und Ernährung, der also da schon viel gemacht hat. Und auch an der Hochschule für Agrar-, Forst- und Lebensmittelwissenschaften gibt es bei uns langjährige Erfahrung in Bezug auf nachhaltige Lebensmittelverarbeitung und Konsum. Das heißt, im Zielbild also lautet deshalb eine Frage, wie Aspekte der Nachhaltigkeit insbesondere neu auch in die Ernährungsberatung hineinfließen können. Und weitere strategische Punkte bei der Ernährung sind bei uns, das wird Sie nicht erstaunen, Food Loss und Food Waste. Thriving Spaces, auch hier geht es wie im Report um Chancen, Herausforderungen von städtischer Verdichtung. Bei uns allerdings steht hier der soziale Aspekt etwas mehr im Vordergrund. Auch das hat wiederum zu tun mit unserer Ausgangslage in den Departementen Gesundheit, Architektur und soziale Arbeit. Ist viel Vorarbeit hier gemacht worden und dort berücksichtigt man neben planerischen Fragen insbesondere auch solche der Lebensqualität, und das heißt Fragen, bei denen der Mensch ganz klar im Zentrum steht. Beim Priority Theme aus dem Report Net Zero Greenhouse Gas unterscheidet der Report zwischen Emissionsbegrenzung und dem technologischen Abbau von Treibhausgasen. In unserem Zielbild nun kommt vor allem die Vermeidung von neuer Emissionen zum Zug, denn wir fokussieren auf erneuerbare Energien und auf CO2-neutrale Mobilitätssysteme. In diesem Bereich arbeiten bei uns verschiedene Forschungsgruppen, insbesondere am Departement Technik und Informatik, teilweise seit Jahren an genau diesen Fragen, insbesondere auch das BFH-Zentrum Energiespeicherung, das ganz stark fokussiert ist auf die Entwicklung und Erforschung von Lithium-Ionen-Batterien und das seit diesem Sommer neu untergebracht ist, physisch untergebracht ist im Switzerland Innovation Park in Biel. Dazu haben wir mehrere andere Departemente, Wirtschaft, Architektur und wieder die Hochschule für Agrar-, Forst- und Lebensmittelwissenschaften, die aktiv mit Fragestellungen zur Kreislaufwirtschaft befasst sind. Und dann auch wie im Report fordert auch unser Zielbild die Suche nach möglichen gemeinsamen Werten. Hier fokussieren wir vor allem auf zivilgesellschaftliche Initiativen und auch auf die Rolle von Gründerinnen und Unternehmerinnen, die einen wichtigen Beitrag zur Verbreitung oder Umsetzung entsprechender Werte leisten können. Also zusammenfassend gesagt heißt das, der Report hat für uns eine zentrale Rolle gespielt, man kann sagen, einen konzeptionellen Rahmen vorgegeben, innerhalb dessen wir unsere Schwerpunkte definiert und eigens ausgestaltet haben. Es geht bei uns nicht darum, die bestehenden diversen Forschungen zur Nachhaltigkeit, die in den verschiedenen Departementen bereits da sind, jetzt nur neu zu labeln, sondern es geht jetzt ganz dezidiert auch auf der Basis des Reports darum, neue Forschung zu machen aufgrund der gegebenen interdisziplinären Erfahrung, des gegebenen synergetischen Potenzials, dieses auszugestalten und weiterführende neue Fragestellungen zu gewinnen. Und im Moment sind wir dabei, departementsübergreifende Strukturen explizit hierfür zu bauen, damit wir diese Aktivitäten auch durch eine entsprechende strukturelle Einbettung möglichst gut begleiten können. Dann haben wir Anfang des Jahres, Anfang 2022, als wir diese Themenschwerpunkte an der Berner Fachhochschule noch nicht gesetzt hatten, schon mal eine Ausschreibung gemacht zu Forschungsprojekten im Rahmen sozialer Nachhaltigkeiten. Ich zeige Ihnen jetzt hier gerne zum Schluss noch ein kurzes Clip, das diese Projekte, die dort laufen, etwas präsentiert, damit Sie auch einen Eindruck hiervon noch bekommen, von ganz konkreten Forschungsprojekten.
Die Berner Fachhochschule BFH leistet mit ihrer Forschung konkrete Beiträge zur gesellschaftlichen Transformation und setzt sich dafür ein, dass die Nachhaltigkeitsziele erreicht werden. Innovative Ansätze entstehen dabei stets zwischen den Disziplinen und durch die Zusammenarbeit von Experten und Expertinnen aus unterschiedlichen Feldern. Genau in dieser Zusammenarbeit entsteht Mehrwert. Sie macht Lösungen und Erkenntnisse möglich. Deshalb hat die Berner Fachhochschule 2021 eine Ausschreibung für departementsübergreifende Projekte lanciert. 10 Forschungsprojekte im Bereich soziale Innovation für Nachhaltigkeit werden aktuell realisiert. 5 davon stellen wir Ihnen hier vor. Gesunde Ernährung ist besonders für kognitiv beeinträchtigte Menschen wichtig, denn sie sind überproportional von Gewichtsproblemen und deren Folgeerkrankungen betroffen und brauchen dementsprechend Hilfsmittel, die ihnen zeigen, wie sie sich am besten gesund ernähren können. Hier kommt das Projekt Integrate aus den Departementen Gesundheit und Hochschule der Künste Bern ins Spiel.
Doch wie sehen solche Hilfsmittel aus? Genau dies erforschen wir im Projekt Integrate zusammen mit der Zielgruppe in speziellen Workshops.
Humane Dichte ist ein Projekt der Departemente Architektur, Holz und Bau und Hochschule der Künste Bern, das Aspekte der sozialen Nachhaltigkeit im verdichteten Wohnen erforscht, implementiert und fördert. Städte werden immer dichter, der Wohnraum immer kleiner. Die Architektur muss humaner werden. Nur so kann sie sich positiv auf die physische und psychische Gesundheit der Nutzenden auswirken.
Unser Team untersucht deshalb, wie diese Bedürfnisse durch neue Erkenntnisse und methodische Grundlagen in künftige Wohnbauprojekte einfließen können, um diese nachhaltiger und humaner zu gestalten.
Viele dieser Bauten sind in die Jahre gekommen und brauchen eine Revitalisierung. Doch wie können soziale Strukturen in alten Hochhäusern neu gedacht werden?
In einem partizipativen Ansatz ermitteln wir gemeinsam mit den Stakeholdern und der Zielgruppe die Anforderungen und bestimmen daraus mögliche Synergien.
Im Gesundheitswesen in der Schweiz gibt es bekanntermaßen einen Mangel an Fachkräften. Das Projekt NAVE wurde von den Departementen Soziale Arbeit und Gesundheit ins Leben gerufen und erforscht Maßnahmen, um den Berufsverbleib von Pflegefachpersonen zu fördern.
Hierfür wird eine Umfrage bei Führungspersonen in der deutschsprachigen Schweiz durchgeführt. In Einzelinterviews vertiefen wir die Erkenntnisse mit interessierten Personen aus dem Pflegemanagement.
Das Projekt Urban Future Lab der Departemente Hochschule für Agrar-, Forst- und Lebensmittelwissenschaften sowie Architektur, Holz und Bau erforscht nachhaltige Lebensformen. In Zollikofen entsteht dafür eines der ersten urbanen Dörfer der Schweiz. Geplant sind ganzheitliche Ernährungs-, Wohn- und Arbeitsräume in einem dörflichen Stadtkontext.
Zentrale Elemente unseres Forschungsprojekts sind eine nachhaltige Entwicklung und ein gutes Leben innerhalb eines Konsumkorridors. So erarbeiten wir für Wissenschaft, Wirtschaft und Politik Leitlinien und Handlungsoptionen für resiliente und zukunftsfähige Städte.
An diesen und weiteren Fragen zu soziale Innovation für Nachhaltigkeit forscht die BFH departementsübergreifend und interdisziplinär.
Ja, soweit dieser Clip. Ich denke, man sieht hier ganz gut oder hoffentlich, dass die Priority Themes durchaus auch in der konkreten Umsetzung in der Forschungspraxis angekommen sind. Vielen Dank für die Aufmerksamkeit.
Vielen Dank, Corina Caduff. Wir wenden uns nun dem Strategieprozess der Agroscope zu, der auch dieses Jahr stattfand. Unser nächster Speaker ist Lutz Merbold. Er machte sein Diplom in Ökologie und Umweltrecht sowie in Tropenbotanik und hat am Max-Planck-Institut für Biochemie in Jena und an der ETH Zürich promoviert. Und er hat bis vor kurzem das Mazingira Center am Internationalen Institut für Nutztierforschung in Nairobi geleitet und ist seit einem guten Jahr nun bei Agroscope und leitet da den strategischen Forschungsbereich Agrarökologie und Umwelt. Damit übergebe ich dir das Wort, Lutz. Ich glaube, deine Präsentation ist gleich parat. Voilà.
All right. Thank you, Gabriela. I'm going to do this in English because I somehow missed this whole sort of doing this in German slides. And I do feel a bit more comfortable actually in English. So, yes, thank you for the invitation. And I just would like to introduce you a little bit on how we use priority themes or focus themes within Agroscope to sort of drive our research program for the next 4 years. It's very timely because we just went through this process and we're going to start a new sort of research program in January. So, just to give you a very brief overview on how we really function, I mean, since we're the Swiss Center of Excellence for Agricultural Research, we're sort of situated within a triangle of fundamental research, practitioners, which are basically farmers, and the politics. And we always sort of need to sort of find our place within this triangle. And the research is usually lasting for 4 years, but it's a continuous planning. And the last program is just ending now in 2021, and we usually have annual performance sort of agreements on what do we have achieved within different projects. So, and this whole planning for a new research program is not just sort of 1 year, it actually is a long process. You already start almost when you start a current program to plan the next one. So what you see here on the left side, that we have, first of all, a strategic discussion with the Scientific Advisory Board of Agroscope, but then we also go out, because I'm coming back to this triangle, we're really trying to identify needs and concerns in terms of what type of research is necessary to transform the agriculture system and make it sustainable for the future. And this is what happened basically in 2020. So we did all these individual workshops where we invited policymakers, practitioners, researchers, etc., NGOs, and to really sort of collect this information and bring this back into a consolidated report. And from that, we basically give that to the researchers. Everybody can read that and come up with ideas to build sort of a research program for 4 years. There's a little bit, and then you have a 1 year process of back and forth, because every project is evaluated internally. Do we have made connections, etc.? Do we really work together, or is it just a narrow focus project? And that really takes time. You've really got to have this time in mind. And it's also not a simple process. The good thing is, next to this sort of relative stringent research program, we still have the possibility to identify sort of certain startup areas where we want to put some seed funding in there in terms of to kicking something else off which might have come up recently. So the overall goal is really to ensure sustainable resilient agriculture and food systems in Switzerland, and we're having the opportunities, and we know certain developments which are ongoing, but we also know what our skill set is, and we have to bring this together. And this is what we usually do within strategic research fields. You see them here at the bottom. I come to this in a second. Because within those strategic fields, we are trying to come from the priority themes to more specific research fields to actually translate that into little projects or into specific projects with the researchers together. And something what is absolutely core for that is the involvement of a wide range of stakeholders. You need to be inclusive here. And it's a relatively complex process. So you need to disentangle that for the stakeholders or bring it to different levels. And this is where, for instance, priority themes or core themes can come in handy, very handy. But you have to choose the right priority themes. So, I mean, if we talk about the 6 priority themes from SCNAT here on sustainability, they might not be all necessarily the correct ones for us when we just talk about agriculture. So those we came up with focus themes, and I will tell you a little bit on how these are sort of connected with each other. Before we do that, and sorry for this German typo in there, those are our strategic research fields. And you see there are different levels. We have just one which is on sustainability, which is number 14. But then we have sort of the cross-cutting themes, which is climate change, biodiversity, soil, competitiveness, smart farming, etc. And then we have more which are very topic dependent, which look, for instance, at plant protection or plant breeding, plant varieties, etc. And these we try to sort of put into boxes, or we call them focus themes. And you will see they're very similar to your priority themes to a certain degree. So agriculture and climate, because we know that agriculture contributes to climate change. But at the same time, also agriculture is affected by climate change. And we really need to think about how can we sort of make systems better in the future so that they're adapted to climate change, but that they're also not contributing that much to climate change. But at the same time, then biodiversity and protection of natural resources. And it's not just climate. There's a lot more behind that when you think in environmental dimensions. That's the reason why I've chosen that as an additional sort of focus theme. Future production systems. That goes way beyond the agriculture system, which you might see when you go with your train to Zurich today or wherever. It's really sort of thinking about systems. Do we have vertical farming? Do we have underground farming? Do we have cellular sort of protein production, etc.? So how can we sort of produce food for the population now and in the future? And of course, animal health and welfare. I mean, you all know that animals are usually sort of bashed a lot because of the climate impact, etc. But I mean, in the end, there is also, not just in Switzerland, but also globally, there's a demand for protein, etc. We know that the consumption will go up, but we need to do the research into that, and also we do it in a sort of context of animal health and welfare. And of course, something what we do together with the WFH is also the sustainable healthy nutrition research. So, how does this come together? Probably the equal isn't the right sign, but it's sort of, you see these interconnections. So in the end, we take priority themes. We always have those in mind, especially when you think about food for people and planet. I mean, agriculture is the main provider of food. And also net zero greenhouse gas emissions, when you think of this. I mean, this is very relevant for us because we really know what the impacts of agriculture are on climate, but we also do know, what I said before, what the effects are on agriculture due to climate change. And this sort of we really have to think about. And that's the reason why we sort of come up with these focus teams. I won't bore you with the teasers of those because they are coming available on our webpage. And maybe one final remark. I mean, in the end, we use those priority themes as a sort of a carriage to inform everyone who wants to access the knowledge or needs to access the knowledge about the complexity of the system behind it. And overall, this, what I mentioned before, the stakeholder interactions, I mean, this is really based on sort of the, a principle of co-creation of knowledge, like the basic agroecological sort of definition you have from FAO, for instance, at the moment, because only then we can transform the systems. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I have also a little present for you. Thank you, Lutz. So I think it's quite interesting to see how priority themes or just thematic work is important, and I can also imagine that maybe for really improving and accelerating our efforts, maybe it could make sense to also have more mission-oriented research or have more really thematic funding programs that foster this research and really encourage researchers to work on these themes or similar themes. In order to delve a bit more into this question, we will now have a panel discussion. So it's now time to turn to the question of how we can strengthen science for change. I'm very pleased to hand over to my colleague Florian Egli, who agreed to moderate a panel discussion on this question. Florian holds a master's degree in international economics. He got his PhD from ETH Zurich, where he currently works as senior researcher and lecturer. Florian's research focuses on climate and renewable energy finance, with a particular emphasis on the role of public policy worldwide. Florian is also an elected executive board member of the Swiss Young Academy. He regularly holds talks, moderates panels, and guides through innovation workshops. As part of his policy engagements, Florian co-founded the World Economic Forum Global Shapers in Bern, or Swiss Sustainable FinTech. He's also a senior associate at Voraus, the Swiss foreign policy think tank, where he previously acted as a vice president. So Florian is really an interesting person.
Bottom line.
With this, I would like to hand over to you to also present our other interesting persons on the panel. over to you, Florian.
Cool. Thank you very much, Gabriela. And I invite all of you up to the stage, and then we can start the discussion. Welcome, everybody. All right, so we have pretty much exactly 1 hour for this discussion, and we'll see. I don't have a clear plan when we're going to open it, but at least I think for the last 20 minutes we'll have an open discussion. I'm going to start with kind of the big idea, then I'll give a short introduction of these 3 super interesting panelists I have with me here, and then we'll dive into the discussion. So the general idea, at least how I understand it, why we're here, is kind of this, it's like a little triangle where you have scientists, where you have institutions, and you have funders. And I think it's not often that they all get together, and here we have them. And the ambition should really be to forge something rather concrete out of this combination. Why are we here? 2030 is pretty soon, and it should be a priority for both academic research and the funding organizations, but I think those bridges are not constructed often enough. So my goal for this panel is to really be creative and to propose very concrete ideas and not solutions. I don't want to say solutions, but really ideas as to what we could be doing. So now, without further ado, it is my pleasure to present on the very left, Julia. She's a professor of ecological economics in Lausanne. And her research is really concerned with resource use and economic well-being. She also, at least as I understand it, but perhaps you elaborate on this afterwards, I'm sure, challenges the notion of economic growth every now and then. So really the core principle that kind of govern our economic system. And in her Twitter profile, which I always look at before I introduce panelists, it says she's an eco-socialist and she's blue stocking. So I don't know what blue stocking means. Perhaps we'll hear more about that as well. All right, and then next is Renat. He is the co-founder of My Climate and South Pole, but he's also sitting here as a board member of InnoSwiss, which is, I think, connected more closely to what we're going to discuss. It says on his Wikipedia page that he invented the first climate credit card, but then the link doesn't work, so I'm not sure. But he's definitely an inventor, and he's definitely somebody who brought a lot of climate solutions to Switzerland. If you have compensated a flight in the past, it was probably somehow with him. On his Twitter profile, he retweeted something, I think this morning, that says we have the opportunity to address climate change and global injustice with the same investments. So pointing to co-benefits that, climate change and social issues can be addressed at the same time. And I picked this also, of course, because it is a bit of a contradiction to the first introduction. The notion of economic growth might be limited. And last but not least, here we have Stuart. He's a professor at also the University of Lausanne, so 2 guests from Lausanne. He's a professor in geomorphology, but he's mainly here representing the SNF, so he's a member of the SNF Research Council. And he doesn't have a Twitter account, at least I didn't find it. But his project has a Twitter account. His project is called Elpwise, if that's correct. Is that your project? It is, right? Yes. And what I really liked is the last post on your Twitter profile was promoting research of a bachelor student. She was doing research on a glacier. And I think it was a great example of, not only promoting the highest level research of almost Nobel laureates, but really the people who do the groundwork. So I really appreciated that, and I think it was a great example. And we had an interesting discussion before this about, transdisciplinarity and why this is hard to do in Switzerland. So now I want to start this conversation with kind of the first pillar or the first set of things that we're going to talk about. And I'm just going to throw this into here. What, in your experiences, worked in the past? Like, what were projects, initiatives, institutions you were involved in that you think they really provided great and tangible results and they really moved the needle and actually provided something actionable? Who would like to start? Also, if you have anything other to say or to rebut from my introductions, feel free.
We'll get there. I can go first. I guess the first thing I should do is explain blue stocking. It's a bit of a funny term. It means, it was a derogatory term for an overly intellectual woman back in the day. That's making fun of some people on Twitter who don't think that. Anyway, so it does. I actually don't think I actually own any blue stockings, but there you go. So in terms of what works, and in terms of what I'd like to say, I think the first thing I'd like to say is one of the things I'm going to be doing this afternoon while I'm in Bern is go to visit Guillermo Fernandez. And I heard before that there's some question about activism in science, but I think that science has to become more engaged. I would certainly have that position, and I think that we also need to have scientific projects and institutions that allow us to have that engagement. And one of the things that we even wrote a paper, which is great. The title is fantastic. It's called From Publications to Public Actions. Get it? Hilarious. And it basically says we should be getting promotions and rewards for getting jailed for civil disobedience, for instance. That would be nice. That kind of thing. So the question is, how do we intervene in society? And I think that in scientific terms, we've sort of lived on a social contract that is now broken, which is that if our science is socially relevant, then society will act as a consequence. So it's like, you can just sit in your offices and write papers and do research, and if anything is relevant, trust us, we'll take it seriously. And that, I think we now have a few decades of proof that that contract was torn up a while ago. And so we also have to think about how societies change. And I don't have any silver bullets, I don't have any answers, but I think that that's a crucially under-researched aspect of what we do, is how do things actually change? And so Guillermo Fernandez, who's now on his 5th week of hunger strike for climate action on the Bundesplatz, he's trying to change things in one way he could think of. But are we actually trying to change things? Are we actually trying to be agents of a huge transformation that our societies need? And I think that that's one of the questions that should be the core question of our research. In terms of what works, in terms of what allows us to do that research, I think freedom is a big part of it. And freedom from disciplines, freedom from topical expectations of what's trendy. I've had lots of very disappointing discussions with my research deans through my career, where they bring me into the office and they say, are you going to be working on priority areas? And I'm like, no, go away. we can now end this meeting. I am going to work on degrowth. Nobody will ever cite me. Nobody will ever give me research funding. I will never publish in a cool journal. We can end this meeting right now. In the end, that turned out not to be true, luckily enough for my career. But I think one of the points we need is we need people to be free to explore extremely uncomfortable and difficult topics, and to focus on the things that they think are the most challenging. And for that, you need a lot of freedom and funding as well. And so in the end, my research was a hobby. It was unfunded. I worked on my papers in the evenings and on weekends, like you do when you have to do postdocs on the topical, trendy things. And in the end, what happens is that I was able to get funding from a very unique institution that exists in the UK, which unfortunately doesn't exist here. That one of the things we could think about, which is the Leverhulme Trust. And the Leverhulme Trust will only fund research that is unfundable by other mechanisms. So that part of the application was great for me, because I was like, oh my God, I have failed so many times in so many ways on so many different research organizations. I am your perfect candidate, really. And so I got funded. And I think that but this idea of really funding the curiosity and discomfort of researchers with the ways societies are currently organized and with the potential for transforming them is the biggest challenge in my view. And so what works would be mechanisms that allow us to go for those questions, to be really uncomfortable, to be really outspoken, and to be really, really critical, including of the trendy topics. Sometimes you have to be critical of those. So.
This is great. So I think it's already a very concrete example that really helped you in your journey as well, which is awesome. Thanks so much. And it is a bit in contradiction to this mission-oriented thinking, right? Where you think, okay, we have to design programs that really fit the goals that we have as a society, and then go from there. Stuart or Renat, what do you think about this, or about your personal experiences of things that really worked well?
perhaps I can follow what Julia said. I think that one of the problems we've got at the moment in science, and actually I should say perhaps a caveat, I sometimes worry a little bit when we talk about sustainability science and not sustainability research, because there are many, many areas of the academy that we wouldn't call science, but that have something very important to say about sustainability, and we mustn't forget that. But I'm going to stick on science for the moment. One of the things I think that is we have forgotten in society at the moment is how to be scientific. And that is because we've created a model of practicing science that is oriented towards a whole system that we could call the academic mode of production. It's oriented towards producing first authored papers. It's oriented towards winning research grants. And I think there's a wonderful philosopher of science who unfortunately only really writes effectively in French, but if you can read her in French, I would encourage you to do that, who talks about the need for scientists to find ways of putting themselves in what Julia calls discomfort zones, but ways that cause us to see the world in a slightly different way. Because it's that seeing the world in a slightly different way that causes the major breakthroughs. And then we had the lovely example of Isaac Newton as somebody who was able to do that today. Now, the problem we've got is we've got an institutional system that causes us to conform and not to actually escape that conformity. And to give you a concrete example of this kind of abstract discourse I've got at the moment, when I was, before I moved to Switzerland 10 years ago, I was involved in a fascinating project which was trying to get people who were victims of flooding, where the government wasn't allowed to provide any kind of solution. These were people being flooded multiple times every few years. And we built a project where we brought together scientists with flood victims, and we did the science together. It's what we call co-production. The most interesting element of that, for me, was that I was actually a part of the study, in that I had someone studying me as a scientist whilst I was doing this work. And this researcher, who's from the field of science technology studies, would come in my office once a month, and all I had to do on that day was work on this project. And she would just sit in the corner and scribble furiously as she watched what I was doing. She didn't interact with me. But she wrote a remarkable paper that described how, in moving the focus of my research, I hadn't just worked on flood risk management solutions for this community. I changed my priorities. I changed from looking towards my discipline, looking towards the academy that I was a part of, to actually looking towards the community with whom I was working. And the result was a completely different kind of scientific outcome, one that would completely fail any kind of institutional evaluation of what the scientific outcome was. The SNSF...
Did you publish it?
No. Interestingly, we actually published the work that was done following me, but not the work that I did myself. Yeah. And it's this kind of fundamental change in the institutions that we've actually got to be thinking about. I call it doing science differently, outside of the models that we've become accustomed to.
And is there anything that comes to mind, a bit in a more institutional sense of what, could give you the opportunity to do that, except for this like very specific and I guess kind of, I don't want to say ad hoc, but probably small project, right? Is there anything that you've seen that encourages that? This doing science differently, this working closer or, towards and with communities?
Yeah, you can look at it from all of the entry points of the scientific production process, whether it right at the start in terms of how do you take an idea that you want to develop in a transdisciplinary setting and how do you evaluate it? Well, our current evaluation systems, including those at the SNSF, would struggle to do that. All of the criteria we use, like feasibility, rigor, etc., in a project that is inevitably going to be much more open-ended, really don't work. But that goes right the way then through to how do you judge the outputs? And your question was quite pertinent. And what is the output that matters when you've worked in a transdisciplinary way to create a new framework, in this case for doing flood risk management, which incidentally has actually been adopted by the UK government. How do you evaluate that in the kind of formats that we require in things like our scientific CVs?
Yeah.
And so there are lots of opportunities, but it requires you to change very radically the way we evaluate and appreciate the science that we do.
Yeah, yeah. Renat, how do you evaluate proposals at InnoSwiss? Or you can also respond to the more general question of what, of course, were things that you think really worked and you encountered.
Well, I'll come to InnoSwiss in a second. Again, I have two hats, right? On the one side, InnoSwiss, on the other side, my day job at South Pole. And I guess to answer your initial question, let me start by saying something that really didn't work. And what really didn't work is communications. So I studied environmental sciences at the ETH Zurich back in the 90s. And the truth is, back then in the 90s, climate science was completely clear. Everybody who had basic understanding of chemistry and physics could completely understand the greenhouse effect and could completely see what was going on. And we could even calculate, we had already then radiative forcing, that was all research from the 90s. And over the following 20 years, it was impossible to get that very basic understanding of science into people's brains across the world. And I still today don't understand where we took the wrong turn and where we got it so wrong. But what I kind of conclude was that what comes into the way is psychology, human psychology. The idea that you can go out and talk about the climate problem, and by the way, it happens also for other topics like biodiversity and water scarcity and all other environmental problems. The idea that you can bring people a problem, tell them how big the damage is, and then believe that they will then say, oh my God, that is really bad, now I'm going to jump to the solution. That does not work psychologically. So that really didn't work. And then I think if science wants to make an impact in reality, it has to really rethink the way it communicates. So following on that, what then actually did work was quite well actually, was whenever science was applied in the real world and was able to make a breakthrough to real tangible things that people could touch, people could invest, people could do something about it. And that I see both at South Pole and at InnoSwiss. At South Pole, for example, back at My Climate Eve, like 20 years ago when we created My Climate, the students, the whole idea was to give people an option to do something. Not just talk about the big damage of air traffic, but actually say, okay, look, it's bad, I should not fly, but at least I can pay for the damage and finance a project that actually does a difference in the world. And that mechanism has so far scaled quite nicely across the world. At South Pole today, we have over 1,000 projects in over 50 countries which reduce emissions. And whenever, the interesting thing is, theoretically, people often say, ooh, should you offset, is it good or bad? But whenever you show them what happens on the ground, that we just planted those mangroves or we just got those cook stoves rolling around in Ghana, people say, that's a good project, I like that. So what I conclude from that is, as soon as it's about doing something, getting real, getting active, you see something, that's when people get excited. They may be, wow, I want to join, I want to be part of it as well. As opposed to we're discussing about the problem. And the same thing I observe at InnoSwiss. It is so I'm actually not on the board of InnoSwiss, but on the Innovation Council. That's a difference because the Innovation Council actually is active in approving or rejecting all the research grants. And so I get on my desk like many proposals from whole Switzerland. And for me personally, this is a source of inspiration, I tell you this. It's just absolutely outstanding. We have from all 26 cantons, from Jura to Graubünden, to Ticino, to Schaffhausen, we have proposals coming from companies pairing up with academic institutions to get something done, to try to explore whether that could work this direction, that direction. So this power, this inspiration that comes from this innovation, that is great. And that is where science, in my opinion, as soon as it gets real, there it makes a big difference also psychologically. So my recommendation really in the future should be when we have ever again a vote, for example, on the CO2 bill, where was science? Where were our examples? Where were all the ideas where science makes a difference in Willisau and in Zweisimmen and everywhere? Where were those examples? Because that's what's exciting people. Instead, we left the communication completely to the fossil fuel industry, who touched the hearts by pretending that only rich people can fly and drive cars. So that's really what I recommend science to be more outspoken, more clear, and show why it makes a great difference for people in their lives.
Thank you. I think that really ties nicely to Julia's statement in the beginning about, to what extent scientists should get involved, or you mentioned the word activism. And in the very beginning of this day, Marcel said or offered his take on this, that scientists shouldn't be prescriptive, but should provide policy-relevant recommendations. I think that's how he framed it. So no policy prescriptions, but policy-relevant statements. And now that, of course, wouldn't involve, getting involved in a CO2 bill discussions very actively. How do you see that, Julia, the role of all of us, or all of us here that are scientists?
Yeah, I think I actually want to maybe bounce off what Renat was talking about, because I think that there were a lot of beautiful things there. From the first one, which was a diagnosis of failure, and then the question is, what do we do with that diagnosis of failure? And I think one of the things that is really important is trying to understand root causes. You talked about psychology, other people might talk about sociology, other people might talk about economics, other people might talk about politics. And I think that one of the things that's quite interesting is that a lot of the root causes lie in history and lie in social systems, as well as technological systems. And I think that that's really an important thing to understand, is that if we're interested in resolving topics, we also have to be doing research into the root causes of our problems. That's not always comfortable. And I would say that the root cause of the misunderstanding of super basic climate science, I have taught it to 4-year-olds. They get it. It's fine. Like, you can teach this stuff in such a way, you basically bring a planet and a blanket to school, okay? And then you wrap it around and you're like, it's overheating because we keep adding layers to the blanket. That's the greenhouse gas explained to 4-year-olds. Yeah, but we were faced as a scientific community with a complete lack of communications training. So in some ways, we were left sitting ducks. And I've taught this semester, I was able to teach some fantastic bachelor students at University of Lausanne, thank God, and see real students again. And I showed them Merchants of Doubt, which is a documentary about climate change disinformation by the fossil fuel industry. And they were shocked, and they immediately came to, the first thing they asked me was, okay, this is what we're up against. You're going to teach us about communication techniques, aren't you? We're going to be able to go into television sets and explain our science really well, thanks to the training you're going to give us. Right. And I have still not gotten back to them, because, of course, we don't have communications training for them in a bachelor's on environment. And that's a big problem. So that's, this is the kind of thing we're up against. We're up against if we're doing interesting research, if we're doing relevant research, we are going to be up against disinformation, we are going to be up against industrial interests, we are going to be up against political power, we are going to be up against corruption. How do we understand them? How do we evidence them? How do we work effectively despite them? How do we expose them? This is the kind of terrain that we're in. It's not a tea salon. It's more like a boxing ring. And do we know how to do research in a boxing ring? So that's one of the things around the problem facing and problem dealing with the problems we have is one thing. And the other thing I really loved about what Renat said was, that it's possible to make people really excited if they can become engaged. And I've seen that as well. But when we're talking about these social transformations, and despite the fact that I'm talking about degrowth involves a lot of investment in the right things like good cook stove and all that good stuff as well. But so people want to work towards a future that is positive. That is maybe the most fundamental desire that we all have, that our students have, and that people in the public have. Except for a few psychopaths out there, and they do exist, people want to work towards a good future. And then the question is, do we know what that looks like? Because we're talking about really fundamental transformations of all our technological, economic, political, et cetera, systems. I mean, when you look at what the IPCC is saying, they're saying full-on transformation, like smooth transition. That would have been great if we started in 1980. It might have been sort of possible if we started in 1990. In 2021, we're talking about revolutions everywhere. And the question is, how do we make those revolutions something that people can understand, want to participate in, have sort of a way of thinking about and moving forward with? Because I think people will want to be part of these revolutions, but we have to make our research something that's not about smooth transitions, and that's risky as well, right? Because you can do curves and you can do models, and can you sort of present a rupture in a way that's interesting and robust and so on? I think that's one of the big challenges we have. That was totally not the answer to your question.
Totally
Sorry.
off topic. No, but it was great. Thank you so much. So I think what I'd like to do is I'd like to ask this question, back to when the things that we can change pretty immediately, also with kind of a 2030 time horizon in mind, and that we can also do something about in Switzerland, right? So if you think about in a kind of a greenfield approach, so don't consider the many institutional constraints that that you've mentioned in the first round and that might be prohibitive, but if you just think if these constraints weren't here, what would you build or what would you encourage to grow in this space in Switzerland? And also to the audience, I mean, if you already have questions, maybe prepare them, because I think I'm going to open up, and then we're not going to do open in the end and then we finish, but we're going to keep it flowing a bit. So, greenfield approach, what would you build or encourage to grow?
If everybody's going to, I can go first if you want. Or go ahead, Renat.
You can take your time, it's okay. It's not an easy question.
It's not easy, but one thing I observe specifically at InnoSwiss, which is my basically window into what's going on outside of our company South Pole. And I should say, South Pole is a global company, right? We are 800 people across the 28 offices. For us, it's very normal to work across any borders. When I'm at InnoSwiss, I realize how fragmented Switzerland is. I mean, we are, it's a tiny country, but then there is all these research centers and university and this professor and that professor, and I go like, guys, what is this? Why can't we be a bit bigger thinking? Why is it? So what I would encourage is a change, perhaps not even start with a change of mindset and ask more the question, how could we make this much bigger? And I think we discussed in the break also about where Switzerland is coming from. When back in 150 years ago, when it was a poor agriculture country where people had to escape to the US because they were starving out of for hunger, so some people went out and built a tunnel through the Gotthard and a few hydropower stations and two great universities. That was massive risk-taking. So I would say what we really need is a mindset towards thinking a bit bigger and taking more risks. We discussed this also a bit before the panel. What I observe sometimes also at InnoSwiss is that the system is such that everything has to be planned. Everything has to be absolutely covered with a milestone. And if you're not meeting it, you're bad and we're not giving you any more money. And that mindset has to change. I'm not saying we have to do bad projects at all. We should have really good projects and we have to monitor them very carefully. But we have to be more tolerant for things that don't work, more risk-taking. And that's not only for the milestones, but only for the type of funding. I mean, to your point before, otherwise we'll never get to the big ideas. So one thing that you should all watch out for is a new format at InnoSwiss that we have just created, which is the flagships. The flagships are actually, there's a condition, and we were very specific to write that, hardwire that. You cannot get a flagship if you're not involving a number of different research entities and a number of different private partners. So on purpose, it's only, this instrument is only open for large consortia, but on the flip side, you can also ask for much larger financial contributions, and you have to be less strict on the actual milestones. So let's see how that goes. But that type of thinking of coming together to solve a bigger problem, that is what I would encourage to really change.
Any thoughts on this, Stuart?
Yes, I mean, I think at base, and it picks up on what we've already said already, it's about rethinking the relationship between science and society. And we live in a system where there is a clear asymmetry in the ability of certain kinds of knowledge owned by certain kinds of institutions to have a dominant impact on discourse. And this is really what happened with the vote that we saw with the CO2 law in the summer. And I think that this is where scientists have actually got to get out of their box a little bit more, and as Julia's pointed out, not to be frightened to transcend this very naive separation between science or research and people, in the hope of making science somewhat less biased. Well, science is however it's done, is biased. It's just who it's biased towards. And that's the sense in which rethinking that and encouraging scientists to actually explore other kinds of collaborations, I think is probably what's needed. But it comes back to me, I think, again, in terms of what you can do practically and what can you do fairly quickly. Well, I think that thinking of some things that the SNSF is thinking about, you can very radically start to shape what we value in things like funding systems. And a good example of this at the SNSF is the radical shift in the last 5 years away from quantity to quality. We've lived with an academic model that's largely emphasized the number of papers, the number of conferences you go to. Aside from the climate impact of all these academics traveling around the world, we're now in a situation where actually we're saying it's the quality that matters. And as soon as you start to move away from metrics, from counting, from numbers, and into looking much more at the impact of your work in largely qualitative ways, then you start to actually find ways in which scientists can show their impacts and show their value in new and alternative ways. And I think
Stuart, could you give an example of that qualitative impact, or how you look at that?
Yes, I mean, very practically, there's an initiative in the SNSF at the moment to modify how we report the content of our CVs. So rather than just you listing the many hundreds of papers you've produced in the 5 years, which most people won't have actually read, you choose the ones that you feel have had an impact, and you say what that impact is. And then it's up to the reviewers to read that material and to look at your assessment and to compare that with other ones. And that opens up a whole new set of ways in which you can say, well, this paper that nobody else has cited, look at how that has changed the way this government is doing this kind of environmental work. And so we move away from the very self-serving, metric-based academic evaluation systems to giving academics an opportunity to find other ways of valuing their research. And I think that's something that we can deal with very, very quickly. The worry, and I have to say this, is whilst an organisation like the SNSF can actually be very flexible in that sense, and particularly because we have a direction that is very keen to really rethink the way we do science and the way we do research. The much bigger barrier is the university institutions themselves. And that is where there is a conservatism in what we do that I think seriously undermines the extent to which we can do some of the things that sustainability research needs.
Maybe I'm going to open it up here if there are questions. Yes, sure.
No, because you said the question of what we would transform, so I just wanted to say,
Sure.
I finally had a thought. So if I could transform the entirety of everything that we all do, which obviously I don't have the power to, I think one of the things that I would like to orient it is obviously in tune with what I care about, which is my research. And one of the things I look at is the links between resource requirements, so which include a lot of interactions with the environment, and well-being. And so I'd like to reorient, and it turns out that well-being is you might think we're all complicated creatures with complicated needs, and that's empirically, at least on average, not true. I'm sorry. We have very simple needs, and we need provisioning systems that provision those needs. And what I'd like to, if I could orient research, I would try to get students, researchers, citizens, people in the private sector to basically form working groups locally and nationally, possibly internationally, saying, let's look at needs, let's look at provisioning systems, let's redefine the way we do funding. Let's actually do this thing that we've forgotten how to do in Switzerland, which is industrial strategy. Let us do industrial strategy that makes Switzerland a country where everybody's needs are satisfied at the lowest level of resource use possible. And we can do that with investment in the appropriate infrastructure. But that's totally not the way that funding is targeted right now. So it's about basically reorienting research towards outcomes, and then bringing in all the dialogue and all the reflection, all the freedom you need in order for those outcomes to be considered in the widest way possible. And I think that would be a lot of fun.
Cool. I look forward to these working groups. Perhaps they can be funded in, in a Swiss flagship program or in the new SNF setup. Are there any questions from the audience? Yes, I see a lot. Who has a microphone? Okay, cool. Yeah, maybe start over there and then circle around.
This is a question to Stuart. Which division are you in? Division 2?
4.
4, okay. I spent 4 years in Division 2, and then I was president of Division 4 for 6 years. And what you tell me sounds exactly the same discussion that we had more than 10 years ago. So the question that I have, if you think about a change within the Swiss National Foundation, we have to maybe redefine excellence, although I don't like this word. And the question is, how do you judge projects that are transdisciplinary, that combine many disciplines? It can't be done by a member of the Science Council. You need panels. It's an old discussion, panels versus... And the second point is, and I'm repeating this all the time, you need to involve more the scientists who do basic science in all the fields, in natural sciences, in social sciences. In the Division 4, you have programs, and they're the people do their research, and they're already maybe used to do this research, and Division 2 and Division 1, and especially Division 3, do their own things. They're not really involved in science for change. How would you like to change that?
Okay, thank you. I suggest we collect another question. Okay. I noted it down, but you keep it in mind as well. There were some questions over here. Yes, could you get the mic to the left side? Thanks.
There's a person over there as well.
Yeah. Oh, sorry, sorry, it's too far. Yes, go ahead.
Okay, thank you very much. Thanks. Julia, I'm Johanna Jacobi. I'm desperately looking for spaces for research activists in the academic landscape here in Switzerland and in Europe. Can you help me? Where do these debates happen on ecofeminism, post-capitalism, on decolonizing research? I don't see it. Where is it? How do you do it?
Cool, thank you. And let's take a third question. Yes.
Well, I'm sorry. Thank you. Thank you all for. I have a comment and a question. So we have to deal with something in terms of communication of science. Science means knowledge, and knowledge is universal. So, but what people like is certitudes. People like to be certain of things. And until university, a bachelor, master, we teach certitudes. Because students have to spell out their certitude at the exam, which is a big mistake. Many young entrepreneurs are much younger than at the university level. So we have somehow pedagogically to teach people research. You understand research and science and uncertainty and unpredicted discovery only at your thesis level. We have to change that probably and make people understand that nothing is really sure, and we have to take risks. It goes back to risk. We have to risk things.
Thank you very much. So great. Now you've coordinated beautifully. We have a question for each panelist. Who would like to go first?
Stuart,
Wait, do you want to start?
Yes. As I said, I serve in Division 4. Division 4 is the only division in the Research Council that contains the three broad areas of social sciences, humanities, the STEM subjects, science, technology, engineering, maths, and biology and medicine. And for me, I'm just very relieved I serve in Division 4 because it's a division that when it works well, and I'm just reflecting on some of the debates we had, for instance, about what kind of national research program in relation to COVID we should support, that really brings out the best that you can get from interdisciplinary working. I think that the National Science Foundation does a good job of dealing with most areas of interdisciplinarity, except I think around project evaluation. And that is the problem that we have with these three discipline-based divisions. That may well change because there are some fairly major reflections going on about the structure of the Research Council. What it won't deal with, and this is where I'm entirely in agreement, is how do you judge transdisciplinary science, where the outcomes can't be judged in normal scientific ways. The best lesson I would give from that is the work we've done in the Research for Development program, which sits in Division 4. This is the collaboration between the Swiss Development Corporation and the SNSF, and there is a follow-on scheme that's going to be explicitly transdisciplinarity based. And around that, you start to see some very, very interesting new kinds of evaluation systems. So evaluation panels that include representatives of civil society, so NGOs, governments, as well as more conventional academics involved in the evaluation process, but also fully involved in new kinds of projects and new kinds of outputs. And to give you an example of that, there was a showing at the SCNAT in Bern earlier this month of a film called La Veine Verte, which is effectively bringing together a series of projects from under the R4D program that have invested in food security in very, very radical ways. And the output of that is a video which effectively is showing, or a film that shows how we can actually do transdisciplinary research that is transformative. And it's based on specific funding streams to deliver transformative research. And that scheme, I think, for me, has two important, if I summarize, two important illustrations of how you can do things differently. One is the way the projects get evaluated, and then I think, secondly, the kinds of outputs that are emphasized at the end of it. So I'm more optimistic that things can be done, but there's still a lot.
So not exactly the same discussion as 10 years ago.
That's right. Yeah.
Great. Julia.
So I'm going to do a shameless plug, which is that we've just formed Degrowth Switzerland, which is supposed to be a bridge between academics and anybody else who's interested. And we have a launch in Zurich on December 10th, which is coming up. So please sign up and come. Obviously, COVID might push it all online, but right now we're still hoping that Switzerland will be a reasonable country. And if things stabilize where they are now, we can still hold it. So that's one space that we're trying to create. But I think that people around the country are trying to create these spaces, but as you've noticed, they're probably not quite there yet. I would say that there's some really tremendous colleagues doing work actually at the University of Lausanne around decolonizing, for instance, decolonizing conservation biology. So for instance, Gretchen Walters and Miriam Tolla and others have set up sort of an anti-racism decolonizing group that is working at sort of the academic level, inviting speakers, suggesting readings and so on, but also at the university level. It turns out that at the University of Lausanne, we had a great gender equality push and sort of changed the institution in really dramatic ways in order to enable gender equality. But that office has not taken on other types of diversity and anti-racism. And so there's a sort of move to accompany that and to make that more of a topic in terms of getting the university to be less bad than it is now, let's put it that way. So I think that these efforts are coming up. I think another area I think that's really interesting for Switzerland is that trade unions here have not yet disappeared completely. And if we're thinking about feminism, there was the Great Feminist Strike, which is the envy of the world in a lot of places. Like, people noticed that there was this huge movement in Switzerland. I mean, partly because Switzerland is so terrible for gender parity. You know, here we are. But there are these ways of engaging between scholarship and practice through trade unions as well. And I think that that's a dialogue that's really important and that we should keep alive as much as possible. Those are my answers. In terms of communication and risk-taking, I think that that's something that we also need to be teaching our students. How do we communicate when we're really sure of something? Not in a scientific way, but in a public way. And how do you communicate when you're not, the excitement of not being not quite sure about something without that dominating the conversation? So I think these communication, these different modes of communication for different audiences are really important to learn.
Thank you. Renat, on the certainty and risk, I think that's one for you, right?
We're happy to take that. First of all, I completely agree with you that this is a major issue, that many people seem to be increasingly, I would even say, unable to take probabilities as an answer. They want yes or no or good or bad, and it must be short and on a. So I think that's I think that is different from. I sound a bit old now, right? But I feel it's a bit different from 20 years ago. I think it has worsened, perhaps through social media. But now the one thing so I fully agree that this is an issue. The question now is, I heard the word teaching, and what I try to do when being confronted with such, you can imagine I get the question all the time, yeah, but Reinhard, isn't the climate, you know, I heard it's maybe not happening and so on. I still hear it, you can, believe me or not. So what I then say, instead of trying to teach about probability, I use a simple example, and I ask the question back, and I ask, so let me ask you this one. What if I tell you your house is burning down 95% sure in the next couple of years? Would you buy insurance coverage or not? And then people go like, okay. So again, to make it tangible, to make it, instead of teaching the theory of probability, which give them a concrete example that could happen in their life, for example, their house or their grandmother's house, that makes people more connected to what you have to say.
Making probability sexy again. We have one action item. More questions? Yes, I see a hand there.
Sorry. Yes, so I think it's a very interesting point about the probability, and I think that's probably also one of the big issues if you talk about activism, that, I mean, as scientists, usually it's not a simple answer, yes or no, but you add a but, and I think then it's a question, of course, how credible scientific output becomes if it's not in this context of saying, yes, that's the probability, but we know it's not sure. So I think like that's a question also for this science for change, and I wonder how you see this issue, that we also have debate that's needed in science, and that is maybe contradicting to a very clear communication strategy. So is that, I mean, for me, that's kind of part of the problem at least.
Thank you. Are there more questions we should collect? Yes, there is one over there.
I just want to, so first thanks Stuart and René for their discussion about how to evaluate and looking more towards quality instead of quantity. I want to go back to one remark of Thomas Vellacott in the discussion, where he said that we need to be in more than one community at a time. Communities within and without and outside the academia. And there I see the problem. Being in one than more academic community brings with it the risk to be kicked out or hindered in the academic career. So what could be done in the future by National Science Foundation, by Swiss Academy of Science, or the universities, to be not in that situation? I just can't, Julia, tell a story. I've been asked once, what do you consider yourself, an ecological economist or a neoclassical economist? Let's just say a stupid question.
Thank you. Are there further questions or comments? Yes, over there.
Thank you very much. I would like to ask something about funding, because what I'm always wondering a little bit is how much can you actually force people to work together? Because I really like the idea of these flagship projects, but then how do you ensure that it's not just a lot of people from different disciplines that are in the end, well, together in a consortia, but not really working together? And then maybe a second question, would it maybe be an option to, support them in learning how you actually collaborate? Because I'm really in favor of all these collaborations with different stakeholders and different disciplines, but in the end, it's still kind of tricky for me to communicate about my research with somebody from a really different field. And I wonder if it's not only important to have more skills in communication, but also in simply working together and working with different people. Not really sure how this question addresses maybe all of you.
Great, thank you. All right, so let's turn back to the panel. I have a personal remark because it just came to my mind when I heard these questions. So when I heard the question about community, that was actually interesting because I'm a postdoc or a senior researcher or whatever you want to call it. And one of the key things I was told now to focus on if I want to stay in academia is pick your discipline. Pick your discipline and really be clear about it and make a very clear case, because whatever you're going to find an open position afterwards, it's going to be in one discipline and you're going to have to argue why you fit in that discipline. And another thing that just came to my mind is once I was a tutor for a lecture for a class, and I set up an assignment. I did it completely wrong. So it was really wrong, and so then the results made no sense, and students presented it, and everybody was confused. And then the advice, and I was like, okay, I have to announce to everybody now this was it was just wrong. Okay, let's next week is going to be better. But the advice I got was no. Like let's just reason for it now. Just like make a good case that this somehow makes absurd sense somewhere down the line. And so I just think that there are so many and these are two things that we discussed now. And I think they're so built into this academic system. It's really hard. Like they're really hardwired reaction tactics. Like that you can never admit, okay, sorry, this was just completely wrong, or you have to fit into a discipline. So just kind of two examples that I wanted to share because I encountered them personally. But now back to the panel. We have a question on communication, clarity versus ambiguity. We have one on the more than one community. How can you be in more than one community, both academic and non-academic? And we have one on, forcing collaboration through funding. Is that even possible, or do we have to support people to learn how to collaborate? Up to you. You pick and choose whatever you would like to comment on. Who wants to go first?
If you want, I can go on question 1 and 3.
Sure.
Both interesting questions. As for the first one, the way I understood it is, yes, absolutely, we need scientific debate, of course. This idea that we always should have an opinion very soon is by no means should that block the scientific debate, and we should publicly and openly tell people that we have different views. What I find important is the frame. So when the debate ends by saying, well, we don't know, we have a disagreement, that could be misunderstood by the public. So I think the important thing is to, when you finish and you write the executive summary, or basically the journalist gives you the floor one last time for the last question, the important thing is that you refer back to the bigger thing, like generally speaking. We actually agree on most topics, but we have one thing that we disagree, so that you take away the idea that everything is just like unclear. Because if you look at the tactics of the fossil fuel industry, they've actually changed the way they do it. When back in the 90s, they were outrightly denying climate change. Mm-hmm. They had to give up that position quite soon because it was no longer defendable. So they switched and say, oh, it's unclear whether or not. So we have to understand their tactics. The latest, by the way, just to train everybody a little bit on what the opposite side is doing. The latest is they say, okay, it is clear, yes, but it's expensive. That's the last one. They deliberately mix up in our brains costs and investments. What actually is an investment in the future, they declare as costs. And because a lot of people cannot distinguish between investments and costs, they fall into this trap. So another one you have to all keep in mind. That's the new tactics they do. Now, the third question again,
there was one on communities and one on. Oh no, you wanted to answer on funding collaboration, forcing collaboration.
Yeah, exactly. So that is a very, very important one, because that's a big risk that, and I've seen this also in Swiss in some instances, forced collaboration. So collaborating is it's not simple. And that's also something I learned a lot when running companies like South Pole. It's very important that each and every person in the collaboration is absolutely clear what she or he is doing and what's the contribution. Because that's very important. People who are just sitting in a workshop in a big table and cooperate, that's very frustrating. Because everybody, at least ambitious people, and we all are in this room, I'm sure, they want to contribute something also personally. They want to have a role. They want to play here or there. So it's very, very important in collaborations, even if you have a big dream and a big vision, while getting there, each and every member has to play a very clear role and has to feel happy and engaged about that, and has to be able to refer back to the bigger topic. Then collaboration can work. But just to believe a collaboration is just a big workshop where we put a few post-its on the wall, that tends to be frustrating. Yeah. So collaboration, take it very seriously. It's not so simple. Can be very, very exciting if you get it right, though.
Do you want to build right on that?
Because I would, yes. There is a lot written about what interdisciplinarity is and what transdisciplinarity is. For me, interdisciplinarity is about being scientific. It's about being scientific because the kind of team you build depends on the question you're asking, and you have to learn to let the problem speak to you. When I talk to students about this, I get them to reflect upon, if you were talking to a tree, how would the tree want you to study it? And it's putting yourself in that kind of position and then building a team around that is the essence of being interdisciplinarity. So the next time a university says, oh, we want an interdisciplinary research centre on sustainability, that's probably going about it completely the wrong way. Because it's constructing something around the existing disciplinary structures that exist, rather than the essence of the problem is that you've got to work with, the challenge that you've got. So for interdisciplinarity, I think it's actually a relatively simple response there, that the people who should be in the team shouldn't be forced collaborations. They should be there because the problem as they know it means that they have a role to do. Yeah. And as that problem is researched, it's quite possible they find themselves redundant. And I've been involved in interdisciplinary projects where halfway through the project, I've said, look, I'm really sorry, this project has evolved now, and it's quite clear you don't need me anymore, and I've walked away. Very good. Yeah. Transdisciplinarity is a much harder one, because for me, the essence of transdisciplinarity is you don't know where you're going yet, because there's a group of people who have some understanding of the environment out there with whom you need to work that is actually going to shape the question you've got. You're going to have to pose, and who you need to answer it. And that's a much, much more challenging kind of project for any kind of funding organisation, for instance, to support. Because we're so used to coming up with concrete projects that are fully specified, that are then presented for evaluation, rather than the kind of open-endedness that transdisciplinarity implies. So I think there's work to be done on transdisciplinarity, but I think for interdisciplinarity it's fairly clear, even if it's somewhat uncomfortable sometimes.
Julia, maybe you want to respond to the several communities question, or whatever you like, of course. But.
Yeah, I think I was part of an interdisciplinary research project full of very interesting people run exactly the wrong way. So I learned something from that. So actually over-prescribing what people are supposed to, it was a European Horizon 2020 project, and we all had work packages and milestones and deliverables and contractually obliged to do it. And as a result, everybody was very protective of their own job that they had to do. And it's only at the end of the project that we kind of became friends and learned how we could work together. And we would have done things totally different had we been able to have that, sort of glue at the beginning. So I think that that's one of the things that I really regret, is that we sort of stayed with the project structure as opposed to trying to well, I mean, if something is overprescribed, it's very hard to fix. And I think that accepting failure, being goofy, I mean, I'm really shocked that you were advised to lie to students about scientific reality. that's not very ethical in terms of like, you know, if the project is a failure, you should be willing to embrace failure a lot more often and frequently, you know, 3 times before breakfast, and do that openly and sort of be able to talk to people and create something new on that basis. That's how we make progress. So I think that would be one of the things that becomes important is how do you talk to each other? How do you learn from each other's frustrations to build new kinds of scientific domains? In terms of communication and ambiguity, I think there's a really excellent project that's being run by somebody called Geneviève Günther in New York, and she's actually a Renaissance scholar. So she's somebody who comes from like literature, but she's become very engaged in the climate domain, and she's founded this association called End Climate Science, which is aimed at media. And it turned out that she's been learning a lot about what prevents journalists and different media organizations from covering climate in the way that they need to do it, where they'll cover a storm, but they'll never mention the cause. They'll cover a flood, but they'll never mention the cause, et cetera. And one of the things that journalists are terrified of is making a statement that is wrong. So they'd rather be safe than accurate if they're taking that risk in communication. And so one of the bridges that she's making is saying, okay, I will make sure that through this association, you have scientists who are at the top, you know, aware of the latest research, who will tell you what is the scientifically accurate way of saying, you know, a probabilistic result, that storms of this magnitude are made X% more likely by climate change, for instance, right? So you don't say it's caused by, but you're still able to communicate the fact that this is not coming out of nowhere. And so basically present weather reporters with a list of things that is safe to say in any given circumstance that they didn't have before. So basically making a bridge between journalism or broadcasting and climate science. And I think that those kinds of very specific bridges need to be built. We don't have them. And I think that that's one of the things that's really interesting to think about also in Switzerland or around the world. And to the point on the communities, I think that it's not just within academic communities. I mean, it's very interesting, of course, to be able to, I mean, as an interdisciplinary person, you get to go to the interesting conferences. I stopped flying for academic purposes pretty much around 2012, I think. And I did have this awkward thing. If you wanted to get tenure, if you wanted to get promoted, you had to fill in a part of the form which was, did you travel to this conference? Did they offer to pay for your flight? That's a box in a form in the UK, okay? And forms with boxes, as you know from Switzerland, have a very long lifetime. So one of the things I had to say was like, well, they probably would have, but I Skyped in, so deal with it, you know? And that was, but I had to go to my head of school and ask, make sure that I would be protected a bit for this. So I think that in terms of participating in different communities, it's very important. It's also where you get good papers written, is if you are able to cut across different domains. I would obviously go beyond academia, so I think it is important to participate in other community organizations. Trade unions is one, very important. Community, neighborhood groups, whatever, parent groups, whatever, hobby groups. I think that we need to have a society. We will be only protected in our society and our democratic function if we are able to communicate across multiple domains. And one of the exercises I gave to my students last semester was imagine a day in a different future. What does your day look like? And I was super disappointed because they basically didn't know how to answer. They responded a lot on like restrictions and oh, we can't consume this anymore, we can't consume that anymore. It was quite sad, actually. And they didn't talk about what they wanted to participate in, like that you would start the day by going to your energy cooperative and participating in the board and figuring out where your new installations are going to be. And then you would go over to your farmer food market and do this. They didn't see them as navigating, they didn't see themselves as navigating across domains. They saw themselves as having one expertise and one role. And I think that is a recipe for social failure in the future. So I hope that we move beyond that.
All right, thank you. Now, I know we're standing between you and lunch. What I want to do is I want to end on one sentence each, because we're all going to have conversations over lunch. What can you personally commit to from all that you've talked about now? What can you personally commit to in one sentence? And then people can actually, hold you accountable to that over lunch and say, yes, I really need this from you. You said you can commit to that. Is there something? It can also be, you know, it can be small things. You don't need to change the world now. Who would like to go first? Stuart, you want to start?
Is this something I've got to commit to that I haven't committed to already?
Does the audience know you've already committed to that? It can be something small. It can be, you know, pay less attention to boxes, for example. Or
Yeah. I mean, what I would encourage the audience to do is go and look at the San Francisco Declaration on Research Assessment and sign it.
Good, thank you, Stuart.
Because that is a fundamentally different way of evaluating academic practice.
Perfect. Thanks so much.
Mine would be optimism and can-do spirit. I think that's the basics. If we are able to approach the people from all levels with a positive message that this is fun, this can be done, I think we're on the first step to engage people and make them do things that they previously were not willing to do.
Thank you. And Julia?
Well, it's a bit of a downer. I would say stay uncomfortable. So if something doesn't seem right to you and it's really bothering you, there's probably some really interesting research to be done there. So just be willing to not be satisfied with what is presented on the surface, and staying grumpy has so far worked for me extremely well, so I can't complain.
All right, thank you so much. Thanks, everybody. Thanks for the discussion. And I'm handing back to you, Gabriela, right?
Yes, this is just simply to say thank you, all of you. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. This was really...
Merci.
Thank you, Lena. Thank you, Julia.
Thank you. We will share these with you. Maybe. That's what we can commit to.
So I think there are many aspects that you now heard that are also inspiring for our discussions in the parallel sessions in the afternoon. And before we leave for lunch, I would like to just tell you where you have to go for which parallel session. And don't worry, if you don't remember where you wanted to go, just choose, choose a new one. So Unleashing Knowledge, this session is going to take place in the basement. That's at the end of the corridor, down the stairs, turn left, and then you see a long corridor. At the end, there's this big room. Then research for societal transformation will take place in this room here. You can just stay here. And the hard problem, interdependencies between sustainability goals, this session will take place also in the basement on the right-hand side, and the workshops are all signposted. And we will start at 1:45 with the parallel sessions. And if anyone needs to leave this conference earlier, we would like to get feedback from you. So you will find at the entrance or exit, you will find a target where you can just put your rating. And of course, you can also... We put it differently, it's not boxes. And of course you can also give us feedback on boxes and ratings and anything, and ideas for our next Sustainability Science Forum. There are cards and pens, so please let us know what you think or what you need. And now let's enjoy lunch, and I wish you bon appétit. So I would like to welcome you back to the plenary. And we are very happy to announce now our last highlight. It's a very special kind of panel discussion. It's a fishbowl method-based plenary discussion. And it will be explained afterwards what that means. It means a little bit of sport and movement, hopefully, for all of you or for some of you, with diverse speakers, and maybe you will be one of them. We will share and discuss main challenges that emerged in the discussions in the 3 parallel sessions. And based on those challenges, we will then in the second part like to collectively bring the discussions around special requirements for funding research in support of sustainable development a step further. I'm very pleased to introduce you to the moderator of this panel, Christian Pohl. Christian studied environmental sciences at ETH Zurich, where he also did his PhD, followed by research in science studies and transdisciplinarity. Christian is also an excellent transdisciplinary teacher. In 2020, he won the KITE Award, which stands for Award for Key Innovation in Teaching at ETH Zurich, for his course on tackling environmental problems. Christian was founding co-director of the Network for Transdisciplinary Research, TDNet, of the Swiss Academies of Arts and Sciences, and founding editor of TDNet's Toolbox for Co-producing Knowledge. And he's today member of the TDNet Scientific Advisory Board and of the Steering Committee of the Sustainability Research Initiative. And since a few years, Christian is mainly. So these things are what he does on the side, and what he mainly does is being co-director of TD Lab of the Department of Environmental System Science at ETH Zurich. And with this, I'd like to hand over to you, Christian.
Thank you very much, Gabriela. So I welcome you to the fishbowl discussion. And fishbowl discussion is, in a way, moving us out of the comfort zone as well. I guess a lot of you and me too, because it is participatory in the sense that all of you, if you feel at some point that you want to say something, you can only say it if you are sitting on a chair on the stage. For that, you have to come to the front and stand behind somebody and vote him or her out. But that doesn't start yet. First, we have like 3 given sages on the stage, and we will start with them. And I'll announce when we start the fishbowl. And the idea of the fishbowl is to, as Gabriela said, to wrap up the day in 2 parts. We have, like, in this hour or less than an hour, 2 questions that we want to address. The first is, could we have the next slide? And the questions will always be on the next slide. What are the big challenges? I mean, the whole day we talked about accelerating transformation. The first part will now be that we ask ourselves again, okay, going through all what I know and have experienced and going through the day, what are the biggest challenges we need to address to accelerate transformation? So this is beyond science and research, right? It's like for us as parts of society, what do we see as the biggest challenges? And I'd like to ask Janet to start.
Okay, thanks very much. So let me just say we had a really excellent discussion in the session on unleashing knowledge with inputs from Marcus Jeni, Vision Landwirtschaft, Anna Stünzi, President of Voraus, and Bin Pierce from the TD Lab at ETH Zurich. And they all presented very interesting activities and projects. And so I get the sense from this, which is just confirming my initial impressions, that there is really a lot of excellent work going on. There are a lot of organizations that are doing the right thing, going in the right direction, but a lot of this is fragmented. There were some discussions in the audience, or questions in the audience about funding opportunities. Things are under-resourced. And I think that one of the big challenges is how to build out of all of these fragmented things that are going in the right direction, how to connect them up. And that could be just a virtual thing. It could be a cross-referencing thing. It could be almost like a chain letter, that anytime you have a chance to stand up and say something, you also say, and by the way, this organization is also doing really excellent work in the same direction, so that we can constantly kind of reinforce each other and constantly show how much activity there really is going on. Because I think people feel a little bit of sense of sort of hopelessness. There's that they don't know how to engage. They don't feel that actions that they can do as individuals will really make a difference. And the idea that they could jump on to a lot of activities and contribute and not have to build everything from scratch, I think that would be a very powerful thing, and I hope we can all maybe take that home and try to implement it. Thanks.
Thank you very much. For those who don't know, that Janet Herring is the director of EAWAG. And I'll not say more about people on the stage, because when you are coming, it's mostly you will say your name and your institution. Sorry. No, that's okay. No, that's okay. I just not tell 10 minutes about
everybody is supposed to know who I am, right? So.
Right. Oh, I think so. So Janet made the point of making others aware of what is all around, and also making yourself aware of what is all around. And I think we have that also at ETH. We have a lot of students that say now they have eco-anxiety, they get so much information that is so depressive. And I think this is also why I would say, either what Reinhard said this morning or what you said right now, we have to also give all the good examples and not only tell nightmares. I think Vellacott said nightmares. Johanna Jacobi is professor at ETH in Zurich. Please, what were your biggest challenges that you think need to be addressed to accelerate transformation?
Right, coming out of the research that I do about agriculture and food systems, one of the biggest challenges that we always encounter is power asymmetries, meaning the unequal opportunities of different actors to influence outcomes. Not only between the global north and south, or however we want to call it, also within Switzerland, everywhere. Power relations are everywhere a problem. And not to tell a nightmare, I would encourage to work on the understanding what power is, to conceptualize it, to work on it also scientifically. I mean, power is not necessarily something negative. There's power over, but there's also power to, and power within, and power with, and there have been many concepts, but not many tools. So we have Foucault, we have Bourdieu, we know that they describe and analyze power, but we don't know how to investigate it and how to deal with it. So I would encourage to do more work on that, even though it is difficult and fuzzy, but because it's everywhere and we have to deal with it.
Thanks a lot, Johanna. One way to deal with power is to have, there's also power on the stage, right? And I mean, the fishbowl is also a way to change the rules for who is in power to be on a stage, because all of you can be here at some point. So thank you for addressing that. We have an exercise of changing power relations right now.
I've talked way too much. Please take me out of here.
Pete Masterly is the boss of the Wyss Foundation for Nature. No? You're not the boss? Academy, sorry. Oh, I should know that. Wyss Academy for Nature. And Pete, you were in the same workshop as I was. What are your takeaways in relation to the challenges, the biggest?
Yeah, we were in the workshops discussing interactions between different SDGs, and if I would translate that into a main challenge, I think it would be how, or given the urgent and needed transformations of society, how can we establish a social contract that really promotes such a transformation or is willing to push such a transformation? And that also means leaving no one behind on the one hand, but also really getting a majority of, or the power to change. And I think in our workshop we had an excellent presentation of a paper by Laura Ebneter and Christoph Bader, who showed how they used a methodology to show how these SDGs are interrelated in a systemic understanding. And it has shown that, of course, many SDGs really have synergies. So they have a potential to shift towards the same direction. But they also showed there are some very crucial conflicts of interest that remain where we have major trade-offs which we need to overcome. And I think that is a very strong message, because if we talk about acceleration, then synergies is the only chance we have. It's only if we can really trigger positive feedback loop that we can bend the curve from incremental and linear change to more exponential change. That's what we need in the urgency that we address. And I think the tool presented is a nice way of finding an evidence base to a negotiation with stakeholders, what a shared target, a shared vision
should be, beyond just we want to continue humanity on this planet, but using the grammar of the SDGs to translate that in more tangible dimensions of a future that we can envision. And I think this is really a promising pathways and how to do it. But we, of course, discussed also a lot of the obstacles of how to do it, especially in the context of Switzerland, where basically with a political system of direct democracy and concordance of interest from the highest to the lower level, we have a huge potential, but it at the same time is also the question if this is the main stumbling block of really moving from knowledge to action. And I think that was an important part of the discussion, but I think we also identified some promising way how this debate can be supported by evidence and can ultimately lead to perhaps change attitudes, to change objectives, and also the willingness of these stakeholders to deploy the power and the levers they have, be it in the economy, be it in science, be it in civil society or politics, to really work together towards this new and shared vision.
Thank you very much, Pete. Now we go out of the comfort zone. The fishbowl is now open. All of you could say, you had the chance to say something, so you can be replaced. That's okay. But you have to sit here. All of you who want to empower yourself and to say something about big challenges that we need to address, please stand up. If there are tons of you, then queue. What you have to do is just, the only possibility to say something is you sit on such a chair. So you please come to the stage and stand behind the person that has to go, and then he or she can just say one more sentence and then you have to leave. I mean, that's the other part of empowerment is self-empowerment and out of the comfort zone, right? I mean, it's heavy. Okay, as long as you are kind of thinking who dares, are there any reactions among you or other challenges that you have in mind, or would you like to react on what was said? Any of you?
Well, I'd like to react to something that Pete said, right? Because I went to a lecture at the University of Zurich a week or so ago. It was part of the Ursula Brunner lecture series. And one of the presentations was about, the whole thing was about civil disobedience. One comment that was made is that what you need in the population to actually really shift attitudes is 25%. And I don't think that's probably an exact number, but I also don't think that you need 80 or 90%, right? You need a vocal group and you need to have a sort of spreading of ideas. But apparently, according to a lot of these studies of different social movements, a really committed 25% is kind of what you need. And I wonder if you could comment on the possibility of getting that 25% in Switzerland for sustainability.
Well, of course, I'm not the expert in this, but it's also what I have read. I think also Pareto, the economist, he also talked about the 20% movers, but you'll also have the 20% resistance. So it's this curve of dealing with shocks and moving into creative movements. I think there is literature on that. But I think it's more, and we discussed that also, what's the interplay between civil society movements and change and trigger points, but also what's the role of the public sector, of the politics, and I think it's an interesting debate. Of course, the two have an interplay, and we had some voices saying in our group, you have to move first from civil society because politics in Switzerland will be always reactive. But of course, I see also a danger in that, because it's a very liberal argument that you delegate or almost privatize the change movement towards the local level. I think you also need the guidance, because the conditions that you frame is the offer that also we as people have to choose from, and we don't have a lot of things to choose except of eating less meat and taking my bike.
Thank you very much, Pete. Yves, in a second, Johanna, did you like to say something? Or? So Yves, please present yourself and then start.
Okay.
Thanks, Janet.
My name. Yves Gärtner. I'm from the Swiss Academies of Arts and Sciences, and I'm here partly as a local politician because we are talking about politics, and I just said one big problem in politics is we are always talking about money. We are not talking about the values. We are not talking about CO2. And this is one of the big problems I think we have. And you said, no, it was Janet who said you need 25% to change something in Switzerland. Well, it depends on what you're talking about. Because for me, as a politician, I have to convince more than 50% of the other active politicians in my town.
Thank you. Yves is not, you have to select whoever has to go. Yves is not only a politician, he also is the executive director of UChange, the funding program for student projects. Thank you, Pete. Johanna, would you now like to say something? No?
Yeah, maybe what we were discussing a lot in our session was the processes for co-creation and for change and transformation. And I think also in politics it's important to think when the processes are not working very so well as we would like to, it's not a fault of democracy as such. It's not a pretext to use instead technocracy, but to work on how democratic processes can improve. And for example, I find it very interesting to experiment with deliberative democracy, where citizens' assemblies come together with randomly selected people who inform themselves and then also take decisions, and with that complement a direct democracy. Why not? So I would really also encourage to experiment more with democracy and improve it instead of saying it's not working. So let's just do top-down.
Thanks a lot. Please, if you could say your name and your institution.
Yes, okay, so I'm Cornelia Krug. I'm based at the University of Zurich, and I'm also the head of Biodiscovery, which is one of the Future Earth research networks based here in Switzerland. And we're actually one of those boundary organizations linking science and policy as well. What I wanted to pick up on, and it's been said repeatedly as well, we really need to think about how we change the narrative, so that we go away, and you've said that it's like we don't need to focus on the economics actually, and we mentioned that in our session as like, think of the wedding cake of the SDGs. We need to have the functioning ecosystem, the healthy planet first, and we actually put that at the center, and then move up from there, so that we actually exactly put the thinking on its head. What do we actually need? What do we want? And actually also move away, I think, and we touched upon that this morning, is we need to move away from the doomsday scenarios and actually think about what are actually the opportunities that present themselves to us. What are the solutions? Where do we actually want to work towards? And actually, I mean, of course, then we being accused again of being left, whatever, eco-liberals, whatever, but actually having these utopias in mind is like, this is actually the futures that we want to achieve. And actually develop really strong counter-narratives to what we're hearing. It's going to be too costly, it's going to be this, that, and the next thing. I think that's something we really need to do.
And who is the we here? I mean, is it...
I think it's science first and then society as well, but actually really have these strong, compelling narratives where we could actually be heading. Yeah.
Thanks a lot. Fabian.
My name is Fabian Kesser. I'm the head of the Swiss Commission for Research Partnerships with Developing Countries. I was also before at this panel here on transformative research, and I think one point that was also very interesting for me was the funding landscape. And if we talk about what needs to change, the challenges that we need to address, I think the funding for transformation, not only for research, but really for transformation, needs to be more coherent. We have a lot of different funding instruments, and we have funding gaps, and we have funding instruments that are parallel and not really working towards the same direction. And I think it is important that we have funding that is already developed more in a transdisciplinary way, so it's not developed by some academics only, but really in collaboration already with the practice, how a funding instrument should look like, and then also from there how research and also other implementation projects should look like, and then to also have a more coherent funding landscape in Switzerland that really fills the gap that remain, and so that we can work towards the same direction without too many gaps.
Thank you, Fabian. Do you mean funding mostly for research or for all kind of projects? Or
I think we can start with research because it's a bit easier there. But at the end, I think if we talk of transformation, we should not separate research and other processes of transformation, but we should bring it together. So there should be funding that combines research also with action for transformation.
Mm-hmm. Any reactions from the other two?
I absolutely agree. I think we need funding for exactly those transdisciplinary research processes. Exactly.
Thanks a lot. Would you shortly say your name and your institution?
Rolf Schmitz, Swiss Federal Office of Energy. So I just want to keep on. So we have a lot of funding instruments, and we also fund some kind of these living labs. And there we face a big problem with legislation. So we see there's not enough sandboxes given. So if we fund it, immediately there is ELCOM or somebody else who say, no, this doesn't go because it hurts some law. And I think there we need a more political progress to get over this limit and to say, okay, for a restricted number of years, this is allowed, and we test it with the population, and not only in the lab, but in the living lab.
We need laws that allow, unallowed things for several years to test, something like that.
This is not new.
Yeah.
The UK knows sandboxes since years,
right,
and we have one in Wallenstadt. We have a city has Eigenverbrauchsregelung, and there was the whole city, or quite of the city was involved, and the problem was there are 2 transformers, and allowed was only 1. And this hindered for a long time to start this project. So we had a long discussion with ELCOM until they said, okay, for a couple of years, it's okay that you can use the 2. Because it's from the calculation of who pays whom was difficult. And this we have to overcome.
Thanks a lot. I think Jakob Zinstag, if you could shortly say your institution.
Jakob Zinstag, Swiss Tropical and Public Health Institute. There was an earlier statement about democratization of science, and I fully agree, and I think in Switzerland we have a high potential to foster actually the transdisciplinary processes around sustainable development in Switzerland. I think there is a lot of room of improvement in that. But all of us who are doing research with more authoritarian countries, I am cautioning you to be careful with transdisciplinary processes because they can be perceived as subversive. So you want to be very careful, for example, when working with China. We are working with Ethiopia, who has at the moment a very anti-Western attitude. And just be careful, don't be naive, don't let to be instrumentalized by anybody when doing this kind of work. This can be very dangerous for you, in as much for your partners.
Thanks a lot. I would like to close this round with the first question, and you are all free to go back, leave the micros here. And, thank you very much. Could I have the next slide, please? So now, I mean, we talked about the challenges very open, and now we would like to focus back on research. Close the day with the question, okay, if we look at research, if we take, Renat Heuberger said, the flagship program idea, if we take that up for sustainability, for research for sustainable development, if we would have the opportunity, let's say, to have a flagship research funding 100 million Swiss francs in 4 years or so, 10 years. How should that be designed? And I mean, the question of the how is, what would be different in this design than what we already have in other funding schemes? That's behind the design, right? What would be the difference in the design? And open, whoever feels ready to say something, please come to the stage. And as long as you think, I'll just go through this list. You're allowed to come twice or 3 times. I mean, there's no restriction. I took from the, great to see you again. I took from the priorities, the ideas that, okay, sustainability research might require support, monetary money to pay the non-academic partners who are participating. There might be a specific preparatory stage, because during the framing people might drop in and out. Capacity building has a particular importance. The real-world experiments, living labs that we just heard, and anyway, the huge learning processes, the undefined and open learning processes. We have two already known faces and one new face. Would you like to start, and then I...
Yes, so my name is Joanne Mastelik. I'm professor in the University of Applied Science, Western Switzerland, and manager of the Energy Living Lab. And I think that what you mentioned here in the list, I fully agree that should be part of this flagship for real-world experiments. That's going to be complicated for sure, and we need sandboxes. But also, there is no funding scheme for capacity building. So in terms of transfer, we have the KTT or the usual dissemination work package, but it's not about this. Replication and pollinization of what we do is not about disseminating and writing a paper or going into a conference. It's really a framework that we really need in order to support the replication of existing good learnings that we have done in different projects. And I think also what we discussed in the panel before, that the funding agencies talk to each other in order to bring synergies among the different programs. Because at the moment, we researchers are trying to get synergies among the different programs, such as, for myself, is the Smart City program and the National Thematic program and the street programs, and we try and do synergies between the programs. But at the end of the day, the funding bodies should also discuss together in order to propose a framework that is coordinating for the public money that we invest, so that we are more efficient in the money that we invest.
So with the synergies, you mean there should be more synergies between the funding programs that exist? Or
yeah, to be complementary, to better understand what tools is funding what, so there is no duplicates, but also for new tools, for new funding programs to sit together to discuss the new funding programs, so that it's coordinated as well.
Thanks a lot. I think you were first.
Yeah, I can continue with that. Just to tranquilize you a little bit, in a few days we have a coordination meeting between InnoSwiss and us to coordinate this flagship and our suite program. Nice. So we are running our suite program since 2 years now, and we have already done several calls. And it's also for huge, it's a bigger consortia than flagship, and it goes longer. So we have 6 to 8 years research on interrelated projects. So it's not only one, so it's a portfolio of projects we ask researchers to deliver. And I actually see two main problems. The first problem is the name of the call. So we had the first call was integration of renewables into the energy system, and no SSH researcher understood. It was immediately there were people from ETH and University of Applied Sciences on technical views, but it was hard to get the SSH. And the second one was living and working. So we thought, okay, this title is a little bit open. And then a professor of ETH told me, nobody sees themselves in this title. And I think this is really difficult for those who have these programs to find the right wording. So we are designing these calls together. We write text together now with people from both parts, and to collect and their ideas. And I think this is a crucial point. Otherwise, these SHAs researchers are always behind, and it's already set. And this is the wrong way. So we have to integrate them very early in the process of designing the call.
Thank you very much. Yves, I second. SSH means Social Sciences and Humanities, and I was part of a European Union project that tried to change that expression into AHSS, Arts, Humanities, and Social Sciences. And I intentionally changed the order. First the arts, then the humanities, then the social sciences. But yes, I mean, very good idea to include them already when you frame like the call, because otherwise they you don't use the words that they would understand. That's true. Yves.
Yeah, I understand. I agree, fully agree, and I just wanted to point out two things I'm missing on that list here. One thing is, of course, as a program manager of U-Change, don't forget the students. They're also very, very important players in all that story. And the other thing I think even more important than students is such a flagship program should also have a clear idea how to deal with failures. Because we had this morning talking about failures, and I think this is a very, very important part of it.
Thanks. How would you include the students? I mean, in what sense? Or
we were talking about transdisciplinarity, we were talking about partners outside academia, but also inside academia there are students and people working for higher education institutions, but not really part of academia, right, in the sense that they are just working in facility management and so on. And I think only thinking in a way that includes everybody could really bring such a program to big success.
I thought you would include students because they have so many great ideas. I mean, that's what we see in U-Change in the program. They have so fantastic ideas of what they would like to change and how they would like to change. It's fantastic. Thank you, Yves. Please, your name and your institution.
My name is Daniel Ziegerer from Sano Durabilitas. This is a non-academic partner, and you can imagine to which point I will be speaking, to the support for non-academic partners. I think this is quite important, but not because these partners need support as such, because of the role they can play, I think, in addressing the gap. And maybe the right way of putting it, in my view, would be to say what we really need is to increase the support for this transformation knowledge that we also heard this morning. So that, I mean, this would mean that the design of these new flagship programs, they should really have that as a priority and have maybe a separate budget line or a separate deliverable to really make it relevant for implementation on the ground and to make it applicable on the ground, to make that really one priority of a new program. And there you might have to work, or you might have to include non-academic partners, because some of the know-how and some of the competencies that you need for making it relevant for the practice might come from these kind of partners. So not to support, not just because they are non-academic partners to include them, but because they can bring something to the table and they can make your project at the end more relevant for closing the gap towards sustainability.
Thanks a lot. We have, at least it seems like we are only men. Okay, I stated that, it's okay. It was a signal, right? Please, your name and your institution.
Sorry about that. Vincent Moser from the University of Applied Sciences, Western Switzerland. Oh. I just want to add to what you said about the partners or the institutions outside the academic sector. It's very important, I mean, in our experience to work with all partners, and in the traditional innovation system, the partners are profit-oriented companies from which you can expect that they would finance at least part of their participation in the projects. But now, if you look at the new actors who are trying to change the society towards a society that would be more sustainable, many of them are other legal forms, are not profit-oriented, like association, I don't know in English, Verein, or cooperative, Gemeinschaft, and all these I mean, some new, some already existing. It's the same for like cultural institutions or social institutions. they are not able to participate now in the innovation, in the research innovation ecosystem because they are not able to finance on their own. They don't have an R&D Abteilung somewhere to work on the projects. The business models are different. So we need to find ways to integrate these new players because they are showing the way. They don't look necessarily for growth. They have other ideas, but they are usually open for replication of their success in other contexts or regions. So I think this is a new category of players we need to integrate.
Thank you very much. Teres, in a second. I think, because I think that's very true. I think the way we think about innovation is still very much driven by economic thinking and products, right? We innovate through products which then go to the market and will change society. And that's why I checked Swiss webpage yesterday or so to see whether, like, you can also, like a company, you can also have a project together with an NGO or with a community or whatever, which then lead to different forms of social innovations. And I'm not sure that I saw everything on InnoSwiss, but I think it's completely right. We have to broaden that idea of innovation and of whether it goes to the market or not, whether it's an innovation that does not go to the market. I think that's a very important point. Thanks a lot. Teres, Pausen, please, your institution.
I'm working for the Swiss Academies of Arts and Sciences. I'm head of the Network for Transdisciplinary Research. There's one, perhaps 2 points I would like to add to these funding schemes, context you were talking about. So language. So if you are context related and when you are working with and in society, you have to take into account that we aren't talking English in the context and in the real world labs as we had heard then. And I think for social innovation, as we were discussing now as well, that we don't have only technical innovation but also social innovation. This is context related, and there we have to shape innovative processes or learning processes, and these are also related to the language that is spoken. The second point is, we had the first slide at the first round of this discussion, at least we never heard anything about the people that are building society, the people that are working within science as well. So Jakob Zinstag was referring once to this point. So when we are in a transformative process, we are transforming ourselves as well, and this we have to take into account. So if we want to change something in the systems, we have to change at first ourselves and our behavior. And I think we have also, as researchers in the field of sustainability, a role function, and we have to give a good example how people can change and how they could change the work and the surrounding where we are working.
Thanks for the language. Thanks for this researchers as role models. Please, your name and your institution.
Thank you very much. My name is Adina Art, and I do wear 2 different hats. One is from a non-academic partner's perspective, from an organization called Biodiversity and Good Company, which I think kind of speaks for itself, trying to bring companies to do more on biodiversity. And we're based in Berlin. We're a very, let's say, effective team of 3 people, so very small. And we've been receiving requests for academic partnerships, but we just don't have really the resources in terms of people. So I do really want to underline and really make the point of, providing resources to partners from non-academic institutions at very early stages, even in preparing a proposal, co-preparing a proposal, we simply have a hard time finding the time because there's so much going on with all the projects that we do. So that's one thing. And the other hat I'm wearing is from the University of Bern, working for a Senate or the Senate Commission from the DFG, the German Research Foundation, also on biodiversity. So this is the other perspective I want to bring in from the, let's say, funding agency perspective. What I experience is that even such big funding organizations, they so much work in silos. So even funding organizations, they have to, from my very personal perspective, have to be transformed. Even different sub-silos in these big organizations, they have to, well, talk to each other at the minimum and then work more closely together in order to even create, for example, such funding programs or provide the means and allow for such processes to actually happen. So yeah, these 2 points I wanted to raise.
Thanks a lot. Anybody here from a funding organization who would like to answer later on the internal silos? That would be interesting. Thanks a lot. Rea, perhaps your name on your institution? I said the name.
Yes, so my name is Rea and I'm from ETH. And I would like to maybe, I think this list is very important and I agree with all of the points. I was thinking about what I expect the funders to expect from the people they fund. Because I'm really about learning. And I think, talking about deliverables is maybe difficult because we just talked about that we might not know the problem yet, so we cannot really talk about deliverables. But I think there are 2 deliverables we can talk about really early, which are like in, I don't know, every 6 months or each year ask about what worked and why, and what did not work and why. So I would actually like that funding organizations are forcing the people that get funded to really reflect about the processes, which I think is really important. So in the end, we do not only know if something worked or not, but also why.
Mm-hmm. So this basically would require a strong reflection of the research that goes on. I think that's Thierry, in a second, that's very important. I think the other point is, how do you ensure already in the phase where you select proposals, how can you make sure that you select promising ones, which is still open? I think this morning, this was the question that Stuart Lane asked, and I think one of the questions is you can look at the proposal and see whether they have a plan of how they will organize collaboration or not. And you will see huge differences. And then still the plan of collaboration might not work. It's a learning exercise, so that's why you then have to observe it. Yeah, right. Thanks a lot. Thierry.
Yeah, I would like to comment on this, and I have an idea how we could change perhaps something. We always have to defend why we would like to do something because we know that this is the best way to do it. Why can't we argument as well? We are so uncomfortable with what was wrong or going wrong since now. So we have to try something, and we have to take the risk that it's not the better way to do it, but it's differently, and not because we are knowing that this will work, but we know that the other solutions we had so far didn't work.
Thanks, Thierry. Other comments from your side?
Maybe just from what has been raised earlier, maybe an open question towards you or whoever wants to continue, which is I would be interested in learning more about the approaches of bringing different networks together, for example, from social science, from natural sciences. Which approaches are out there, which work? That would be something I would be interested in.
You mean in general for transformative research or for accelerating research?
For example, for such funding programs, for example, right. In the specific context maybe of the question. Yeah.
Is there the answer? The answer is coming?
Yeah, I think the answer is not so difficult. So we, as a funder, we have to write this into the call text. We do so we prescribe the number of different institutions from universities So it's not possible to have only a ETH or a HSO application. So they have to have a consortium which consists from different types of universities, from communities. We say industry has to be part of it, and I think this works. This is I think it's the most effective progress you can do, because then they have to react. But I actually wanted to answer to some remarks of Yves, was the name, who was sitting here, about the risk, the failing of research. And I think there are tools. There's for instance, Spark with the SNF allows young or researchers also to test. And we have within Sweet, we have also a SOUR program, and this is for researchers for 1 or 2 or 3, having time for 6 until maximum 18 months, and they get money, and they don't get milestones. They just deliver after the time, they deliver new ideas how to do research on a topic that everybody does, but we want to have it different. And I think this should be taken more often to push researchers to risk, because the research is not only success, but there's a lot of failure.
Janet, I'll just come to you in a second. And then I think this will be the last round. I once submitted a proposal where we said, let's put 1/3 of the money just dedicated to social learning. We will have aperos and meetings. And they didn't accept it for probably other reasons. But would you accept a proposal that says 1/3 of the money goes into social learning?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Good. You know, we had the first SOUR, we had only one up to now, but the first one we bound it always to the topic of a sweet coal, right. And this was also to renewables in the energy system. And we had only a little budget planned, but it was 75 proposals, and so we have an international panel, and they have to choose the 4 we can fund. And I think this is our problem, that we don't have enough money, so we have to work on that and to get more. But I think that we are quite open. There's actually no limit.
Fantastic.
That's what actually the idea is of this project. It just should go in this case towards renewables, but the next time it's maybe towards something else.
Great, thank you. I think we only have time for 2 more. So it's Janet and Pete.
My name is Jeanette Behringer. I'm with the University of Zurich, and they're responsible for sustainable development in research and teaching. I have 2 comments to this kind of maybe program, which involves in the near future. I think when we are talking about transdisciplinarity and interdisciplinarity and sustainable development, there is sometimes a mix of 2 levels which should be divided. The one is to do research on transformation, and the second is do collaboration with the practice. And I would like to encourage that these 2 phases and these 2 levels of doing science, doing research on the one hand, and on the other hand, doing collaboration with the practical field, and then I would not name it non-academic partners. I would name it collaboration with the economical field, with the politicians, and with civil society. And I would strongly support to try to spend money for this collaboration in the society, which is not research, but which is collaboration, and which means that science is in the practical field and trying to do also politics, which is contested, I know this, but these are 2 levels of engaging in the field of transformation, which is often mixed, in my observation.
Thanks a lot. Pete from the Wyss Academy, you have the last word, I guess.
Sorry for coming back, but when looking at the list from the audience, I just felt I wanted to share perhaps personal experience working for CD over the past 10 years. You know, I think working for CD, it was always clear, if you want a project from the Swiss National Science Foundation, you need to have at least a research question. And if you want money from the SDC or BAFU or whoever, from donors, you must be clear about the results that you will achieve. And if you look at this list, you have neither of those. So you really, in terms of funding, you have a major death valley between those two extremes. And what is the consequence? I think there are three options, and perhaps you need to combine them. I think either you find another donor, foundations, philanthropic money, and so on. That's what we try to do. Second is you create an institution for which you raise funds, and then you offer a safe space where you can work differently. Or the third, you really change the donors. And this is, for example, these are the discussions about the Global Funders Forum happening, which the International Science Council is leading, where they try to convince development and science donors to unite or to join forces behind shared missions and so on. So I think these are basically the options. And a smart move is probably to try to combine them. And, I think Vellacott's example of the ETH, 150 years? I don't want to insult anybody. 175 years, how much was it? Anyway, I wonder if this bold undertaking of creating ETHs in Zurich, how this has resonated at that time. So I'm not sure if the science funders would have thought, yes, engineers, that's really what we want to fund. And I think that's somehow the dimension in which we have to think. What is a federal school of transformation and who is funding it?
Fantastic last word. Thank you, Pete. So that was it from the Fishbowl. I thank you very much. I think you were a fantastic audience, because the Fishbowl is like basically in your hands. So thanks a lot. And then I'll hand over to Peter, I think. Thanks a lot.
Well, I can take this off, can't I? We're coming to the end of a very exciting, invigorating day. I was asked to wrap up saying a few outcomes out of this discussion. So it's just a very personal view about what this was all about and what I think we need to do next. What was it all about? Well, first of all, as Thomas Vellacott made so clear, sustainability is the challenge of our time. If we don't address the issues of sustainability, then we can forget everything else. And it's also clear that those engaged in research in some way or other have an essential role in helping societies make the kinds of changes which are needed. Thomas Vellacott again said it very succinctly: no transformation without science. But he also said that there's no way that we can provide that academic and scientific support through business as usual. It needs changes in how we do research, and it needs deep-seated changes in our institutions. And the Sustainability Research Initiative, I think, more than anything, exists to help build and support and to strengthen and encourage and motivate a community, the community of all those who are engaged in science for sustainability in some way or other. So it's all of you, the community. And we really wanted this meeting, the first Sustainability Science Forum, to be a meeting for you, for meeting your needs for the community. And our goals today were really threefold. We wanted to talk about how we can use existing scientific knowledge. There is a vast amount of knowledge produced that exists, and more is being produced every year, which is relevant to issues of sustainability. And the vast majority of that is simply not being used. And you could say it's a scandal. You could say it's a financial scandal, but much more, it's a scandal when this knowledge is so urgently needed that it's not being effectively applied. So the whole issue of communication and unleashing knowledge, as we called it, was important. Secondly, we wanted to talk so that we understand and have a clear view about what is special about the kind of research that we're talking about, research for transformation. Thirdly, it seemed to us that the really most difficult problem in all of sustainability research is the interdependencies, that in a complex system, if you do something there with the best of motives, it may have a completely unintentional and perhaps negative effect somewhere else. And so the trick lies in exploiting the synergies and in minimizing the negative trade-offs. So those were the three discussions, and I'm just going to go and give you a very few kind of bullet points of the points which struck me. It's by no means a systematic summary of today's discussion, but they're merely the points that discussed me. And by the way, there's no questions afterwards, so these are simply my thoughts on what struck me. And the unleashing knowledge, it just came across, it came up time and again. So many people mentioned it. It's hugely important. It's underfunded and currently very inadequate. And Julia Sternberger said, we simply have no training. There is no adequate training, particularly in how to explain to people, ordinary people who are not concerned with statistical analysis, how you understand probabilities and certainties. Simply no training. Another thing that I got was communication is very hard work. I sat on a talk from Marcus Jenny, who for many years has been an outstanding work developing biodiversity in intensive agricultural systems and talking to farmers and so on. And what he made very clear is it is very hard work, and that you have to tailor your messages and the language you use and the media to the audience concerned. Curiously enough, most farmers in the Klettgau don't read scientific papers. And very often the best thing is not to deliver the message yourself, particularly if, like me, you have a very funny English accent when you're speaking German, but to get local stakeholders to speak to local stakeholders, farmers to farmers, clergy to clergy, and so on. Even better is if you can provide a living example, a demonstrator. And I've mentioned the Klettgau and this work of creating a biodiverse but productive agricultural landscape. By far the best way of communicating messages about sustainability. We also talked a little bit about communicating values, and this is often the excuse for academics not to get involved. They say, well, actually, this is all about values. These are normative issues. That's none of my business. But you can't escape it totally. And one message I got is that we all, whether we like it or not, play multiple roles. Sometimes perhaps we are the objective scientist, but we're all citizens and we all have many other roles as well. And somehow we need to develop our skills of not sacrificing our values, but simply making it clear what role we are playing in a particular context. Julia Steinberger told us to be prepared for discomfort, and I made a note of her very graphic explanation that when you enter into communication, you are entering a boxing ring. And that boxing ring, the other people in the box ring are very well-funded lobbyists, and that you must expect, therefore, to have some hard hits, and you must have to contend with false facts and false narratives and so on. So unleashing knowledge really came across as an important area that we will certainly come back to another time. The second one was research for societal transformation. Janet Herring emphasized on the panel a few minutes ago that one of the sort of catastrophes in Switzerland is that we are so fragmented. There are so many groups, individuals, institutions doing excellent work, but scarcely working together. And in these big questions of sustainability, we must come together. And again, that is why we need a sustainability science forum, a place where people meet and develop some sort of an identity as a community and working on the same problems. There was another question which came up, and that is the nature of sustainability research. And clearly there's a temptation and a need to tackle problems. And a very popular phrase today is mission-oriented research, where you try and identify a problem, and then you bring all the science and expertise you need to tackle that problem. Plastic in the ocean is an example, a very clearly defined problem. And what do you have to do to get a plastic-free ocean? But it must be more than that, because some problems are clearly identifiable and we can use existing knowledge and technology to solve them. But other problems, there are problems where simply our conceptual understanding is completely inadequate. And we mustn't turn sustainability science simply into solving problems. We've really also got to do some fundamental thinking, breaking the current paradigm. And that is very high-risk research. But along with the let's solve a problem type of research, we also have to have much deeper thinking, high risk, but with the possibility of really coming up with new ways of thinking about the problem and perhaps radically new solutions which would occur to no one at the moment. And I believe any flagship project in sustainability really has to have that element in it of thinking outside the box, in the belief that some of those ideas will be very important. Someone said we need to, again, it's this discomfort. We also need to explore topics which are uncomfortable, difficult topics, and Johanna, I think, mentioned power and power relations. And there are topics that you don't really want to go there, perhaps because you will bring the lobbyists out and you will bring critical comments and so on. But they all belong to it. And doing uncomfortable research, being outside your comfort zone, is clearly part of the process. On the other hand, and Thomas Vellacott mentioned this, we do need to provide a positive vision. The psychology of the research and how we present it is clearly very important. He had this graphic mentioning, I had a dream and not I had a nightmare, which stuck in my mind. The type of research, it goes without saying that transdisciplinary research which breaks out of the boundaries of academia and is done, formulated and conducted with stakeholders in society is very important. And we need new ways of assessing that research, which Stuart Lane mentioned. And then very finally, Pete Messerly, and my last little mention was, he said, maybe we just need radically different institutions and donors. My belief is we need to try and change the systems within which we work. But it may be that to try and move ahead with this research, we cannot always rely upon the institutions and donors which have served us in the past. Then the third question was what we call the big problem, the interactions between subsystems in a very complex system, and we have to take advantage of the synergies and try and avoid the negative trade-offs. Various thoughts occur to me here. Obviously, it needs a holistic approach, and it's the case that our research institutions are mostly not organized very effectively to take a holistic approach. There's a famous phrase some of you must have heard, the world has problems, but universities have disciplines. And despite many efforts to try and create genuinely interdisciplinary research in universities, most university research is still disciplinary. But one could also say the world has problems, but governments have departments and Bundesämter and so on. And I know from contact with various governments that they struggle at least as much as academic institutions with the siloed structures of their administrations, which are simply not conducive to solving these hard problems of sustainability. Then another point which came up was it's essential that we establish a social contract that will support transformation. Basically, everybody, there has to be a kind of common view that is just generally accepted in society that measures which are leading towards sustainability, sometimes individually uncomfortable, are essential and important. And how do we create that social contract? And the more I've worked with our white themes, I see this issue of the values and visions and pathways, how society develops that common view as perhaps the single most critical issue related to sustainability research. And I suppose, somehow, maybe naively, I see the answers lying somehow in really strengthening discussion across societies, strengthening societal discourse. And we talk a lot about science and policy and need to strengthen that, and obviously we do. Science and society, we need to strengthen that discourse. We need to strengthen education. Somehow we need to create habits, which I believe in a way we've lost as the world has become larger and more complicated and more dependent upon mass media and so on. The kinds of societal discourse which perhaps existed in an Alpine Gemeinde 500 years ago don't exist anymore, but we have to create them, recreate them. That's a very personal view of the challenges ahead. So a fascinating discussion, a really rich and fascinating discussion, and a lot to think about it. So what's next? What's next for the Sustainability Research Initiative? Well, we're going to carry on with our research agenda, with our priority themes. We're going to thicken them out, and our ambition is to see that there is funded research in all of those topics. We won't really be satisfied until we see that those great ideas for priority research for Switzerland are actually being turned into research leading towards implementation. We are engaged in a sustainability science dialogue, and here we are simply wanting to have conversations with institutions about the opportunities for that institution to engage in sustainability science. And we've had a few already, and they've been very different because different institutions have different needs. They're at different stages in their sort of path along this road. But they've all been positive. They've really been and I think the institutions have just found it helpful for a sparring partner, a group who can come in and talk about these issues with an outside perspective. And so we've got more of these planned, and we will continue rolling along simply as necessary. And you know, we do hope that you all involve yourself in some of those. We are engaging in discussion with policymakers. We're talking to funding agencies. We're doing what we can to sort of encourage perhaps more flexible research programs for sustainability. Very important is international collaboration, and the Sustainability Research Initiative is also the national committee of something called Future Earth. And Future Earth is an international organization, perhaps the leading international organization representing sustainability science. And it has, and by the way, in Switzerland, quite a number of their global research networks are based in Switzerland, but it has the resources and the networks, the connections, so that if you're trying to build a partnership, then the Future Earth is a good way to do that. And then finally, as I've said, most important, we want to be simply a platform for everyone who's interested in these questions of sustainability and sustainability science. So we hope there will be a Sustainability Science Forum 2022. And if you want to know more about how things are developing, then we also have a newsletter. You can see us on the website. So that's what's next for SRI. Now I'd like to say, what's next for you? And I do hope that you found this a useful and inspiring meeting, that if you're formulating new research projects, you'll think about these priority themes, that if you're interested, you'll participate in one of the sustainability science dialogues, or perhaps discuss with your institution whether perhaps a sustainability science dialogue should be held in your institution. Most importantly, I hope that you will think about, if you've not been engaged in sustainability science projects, that you will begin to talk about that you'll begin to form partnerships and discuss them. And I suppose the thing we're most interested in is that there should be a large kind of flagship project related to sustainability, which can represent a kind of sort of an intellectual think tank for questions of sustainability in Switzerland. And you might say, well, there's no point in planning one of those. There isn't any funding for it yet. I would say not at all. Start thinking about it, because very often these funding opportunities come up quite quickly, and those who've done their homework and thought about it and got plans and contacts and questions are in the best position in order to take advantage of them. And there will be, I'm sure of it. There has to be a coordinated, large program of sustainability research in Switzerland in the near future. I hope you'll engage in discussions on changing your institution, what we call the enabling environment for sustainability research, breaking down the barriers between the departments or the faculties, making it easier to do interdisciplinary and transdisciplinary research. Perhaps I'd encourage you to try and communicate policy-relevant research in ways which are really useful to the people who can benefit from them. So many things to do, and sign up when the chance. Give us your wishes for the next Sustainability Science Forum. And before you leave this building, as you go out, just on the left-hand side, there's a poster where you can give us some feedback on this meeting. You take a coloured sticker and you stick it somewhere on the poster, and that will give us some idea of what you think about it. If you have ideas for another Sustainability Science Forum, please let us know. If you want to organise something, I hope it will really become much more of a bottom-up meeting. This one had to be top-down, because it was the first one, but I really hope it'll be a bottom-up one, and the most useful things that happen in the meeting are not the formal sessions, but the conversations which happen over coffee. So that's what's next for you. And finally, all I need to do is to say thanks to many people who've been involved in organising this. I'd like to thank all of the speakers and moderators of today for, I thought, what were uniformly outstanding contributions. I'd like to thank the conference board. There was a small group of people who got together and planned this and came up with a concept for a Sustainability Science Forum. I'd like to thank our parallel session partners. Because we want to build a community, we really want to have partners involved, and they include the SDSN, the Centre for Development and Environment, TDNet, KFPE, and ARE. We're all partners in particular sessions. Thank you very much. I'd like to thank all of those who assisted today in various capacities, sort of checking our COVID entry things and all the many other things, simply so that the day ran smoothly. I'd like to thank the Swiss Academies, and particularly SCNAT, and the steering committee of the Sustainability Research Initiative, and all of the working parties for the priority themes. And finally, I'd like to thank the Sustainability Research Initiative team, and very particularly Gabriele Wilser, who's played a really outstanding role in this. And I must say it was a bit stressful. You know, as the COVID numbers were busily going up last week, we thought, oh dear, is something going to happen? Shall we cancel it? What shall we do? And so on. And we finally put on a sort of online version of this. Anja Bretzler, who was also very strongly engaged in arranging this, and Anne-Catherine Minig. So thank you very much, particularly to you, for organising this meeting so effectively. And finally, I'd like to thank all of you for coming along in these still difficult circumstances, for your very active and lively engagement, the interesting discussion, and we'll finish with an apéro now. Thank you very much.